They stripped his father's name from the cathedral walls on a Tuesday. Cedric Ravenshade stood in the courtyard of Blackthorn Keep, watching two crown masons chisel the Ravenshade crest off the northern archway, while snow collected on his shoulders like ash from a fire nobody else could see. He was 23 years old. His hands were still bruised from the funeral procession where he had carried his father's coffin alone because every noble family within 200 miles suddenly discovered reasons not to attend. The kingdom of Evelyne had already decided what Cedric Ravenshade was: a dead man's son, a title attached to nothing, a wolf cub whose teeth had not yet grown sharp enough to matter. What nobody understood, and what you will see unfold if you stay with this story through its darkest corridors, is that Cedric did not need their belief. He needed their fear. And fear, unlike loyalty, could be manufactured from absolutely nothing. The first mason paused, his chisel hovering above the stone. "Your Grace, should we leave the lower inscription, the one your grandfather commissioned?" Cedric did not look at him. His eyes stayed locked on the gray horizon where the sea hammered the black cliffs beneath his castle with a violence that mirrored something coiled tight inside his chest. "Touch it," he said, "and I'll have your hands removed before the mortar dries." The mason went back to work on the upper crest without another word. Garrett Hale, the only man in Evelyne who still called Cedric by his first name, leaned against the iron gate behind him. Garrett was 46, built like a dockyard wall, scarred across both forearms from a decade of military campaigns that had ended when a cannon blast shredded his left knee. He had served Cedric's father for 20 years. Now he served the son, though he sometimes wondered whether serving and surviving had become the same thing. "The Crown's messenger arrived an hour ago," Garrett said. "They want a formal acknowledgement of your father's debts. Full accounting, signature by the end of the month." "My father's debts. 17,000 gold standards, accumulated over the last 3 years of his governance. The Crown claims the Northern Territory operated at a deficit under his authority." Cedric finally turned. The cold had reddened his face, but his eyes carried a temperature colder than anything the weather could produce. Gray eyes, almost silver in certain light, the kind of eyes that made men forget what they were about to say. "My father ran this territory at a surplus for 14 years. The deficit appeared after Hargrove and Morcant restructured the trade agreements to bleed our ports dry. 17,000 gold standards didn't vanish into administrative failure, Garrett. It was stolen, methodically, over 36 months, by men who needed my father weak before they could afford to kill him." Garrett said nothing. He had learned that when Cedric's voice dropped below a certain register, the conversation was no longer a discussion. It was a verdict being delivered. "Send the Crown's messenger back with a counter request. I want a full audit of every trade agreement modified during the last 4 years. Every signature, every amendment, every witness." "They'll refuse." "Of course they'll refuse. That's the point. Their refusal becomes evidence that they're protecting the men who destroyed my father. I don't need them to cooperate, Garrett. I need them on record choosing not to." Garrett studied the young duke's face. There was something different about Cedric since the funeral, something that had calcified behind his expression, turning grief into architecture. The boy who had once ridden wild horses along the coastal cliffs for the sheer joy of velocity was gone. In his place stood a man who treated every interaction like a chess position where losing meant dying. "You're going to make enemies of the entire court," Garrett said carefully. "I inherited my father's enemies the moment his heart stopped. The only question is whether I manage them or they manage me." Cedric pulled his gloves tighter. "I choose the former." He walked back into Blackthorn Keep without waiting for a response. The iron gates groaned shut behind him. The masons continued their work. Snow kept falling on the courtyard stones, and Garrett Hale stood alone in the cold, watching the doors close, thinking that the most dangerous thing about Cedric Ravenshade was not his anger. It was his patience. 7 years passed, and in those 7 years the boy who had stood in a frozen courtyard watching his family name get chiseled off stone became something Evelyne had not seen in generations. Cedric Ravenshade did not rebuild House Ravenshade through charm or diplomacy or the careful cultivation of alliances that most nobles relied upon. He rebuilt it through precision violence applied at exactly the moments when his enemies believed themselves safe. Lord Aldrin Hargrove, whose manipulated trade agreements had drained the northern ports, discovered that his shipping contracts had been systematically invalidated through obscure maritime statutes that Kadrick's legal scholars unearthed from archives nobody had touched in 80 years. Hargrove lost his fleet within a year. He lost his estate within 2. By the 3rd year, he was petitioning the crown for a minor administrative post just to feed his household. Kedrick did not celebrate. He barely acknowledged it. He simply moved to the next name on a list that only Garrett and one other trusted advisor had ever seen. The list had 11 names. 7 years later, 9 of those names had lost their titles, their lands, or their freedom. The remaining 2 belonged to men powerful enough that removing them required something more than legal warfare. They required the kind of patience that most men confused with inaction. Lord Selwyn Morcant, father of Lady Celine Morcant, controlled the eastern provinces and maintained direct influence over the crown's military appointments. He was the architect of the conspiracy that killed Caedric's father. Caedric knew this with absolute certainty. He had known it since year 2. But certainty without leverage was just another form of suffering. So he waited. And while he waited, Blackthorn Keep transformed. The frost-covered towers that had once symbolized decline became monuments of calculated authority. The castle's corridors, lit by hundreds of candles that servants maintained around the clock, hummed with a silence that visitors described as oppressive, but that Caedric's household understood differently. The silence was not emptiness. It was control made audible. Every servant knew their role. Every guard understood the consequences of failure. Every door opened and closed at precise intervals, because Caedric Ravenshade ran his territory the way a surgeon operated on a dying patient, with absolute focus, zero sentimentality, and the understanding that hesitation killed faster than the wound itself. 3 rules governed life inside Blackthorn Keep. Never lie to the Duke, never touch what belongs to him, never ask about the West Wing after midnight. The rules were not written anywhere. They did not need to be. The people who had broken them no longer worked at the castle. Some of them no longer worked anywhere. Mercy had become something Caedric studied the way a mathematician studied an equation he had already solved. He understood its components. He recognized its theoretical value. He simply no longer found it applicable to his circumstances. Desire was worse. Desire was the crack in the wall that let the weather in. Caedric had watched desire destroy men far stronger than himself. His own father had trusted too freely, loved too openly, and died with poison in his blood and betrayal in his own dining hall. The lesson was not subtle. The lesson was that the moment you allowed another human being to matter more than your own survival, you handed them the exact weapon they needed to end you. Caedric had absorbed that lesson the way iron absorbs heat, completely, permanently, without visible distortion. Then Edmund Vale's carriage arrived at Blackthorn Keep. Garrett brought the news to Caedric's study at 9:30 on a Thursday evening. The fire had burned low. Caedric was reviewing naval supply records, his jacket discarded over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating on the desk beside him. "Edmund Vale is here," Garrett said from the doorway. Caedric did not look up. "I'm aware. I summoned him. He brought his daughter." That made Caedric pause. His pen hovered above the ledger. A droplet of ink fell onto the page like a small dark wound. "He was not instructed to bring his daughter." "No, but he did. She's in the carriage, in the snow. She's been out there for 20 minutes because Vale's been in the entrance hall arguing with your steward about whether she should be permitted inside." Caedric set the pen down. He leaned back in his chair and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose, a gesture that Garrett recognized as the closest thing to frustration the Duke ever permitted himself. "Edmund Vale owes this house 43,000 gold standards. His estates have been leveraged against crown debts he cannot service. His remaining assets consist of a name that no longer carries weight, and a daughter he presumably brought here because he has nothing else to offer." Caedric's voice was clinical, almost bored. "He's going to propose guardianship transfer. He'll frame it as an arrangement of mutual benefit, but what he means is that he wants me to accept his daughter as collateral for a debt he knows he'll never repay." Garrett shifted his weight. "And if that's exactly what he proposes?" Caedric opened his eyes. "Then he's even more desperate than I estimated, which means the Morcants have already begun pressuring him. which means I need to understand exactly what Edmund Vale knows about the Eastern Alliance before they get to him first. So you'll accept? I'll hear what he has to say. That's not the same thing. But it became the same thing within the hour. Edmund Vale was a man who had once commanded respect in the halls of Evelyne's lesser nobility. Broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a voice that carried the residue of authority, even when the authority itself had evaporated. He sat across from Caedric in the study's leather chair and presented his offer with the rigid dignity of a man who understood that dignity was the only currency he had left. She's educated, well-mannered. She speaks 3 languages and manages a household as efficiently as any woman in the kingdom. Vale's hands gripped his knees. The knuckles were white. She's not a servant, Your Grace. I'm not offering you a servant. Then what are you offering me, Edmund? Guardianship, legal responsibility, a ward of your house until the debt is settled or until she marries. Whichever comes first. Caedric studied the older man with an expression that revealed nothing. You're offering me your daughter because you've run out of everything else. Vale flinched. The truth landed like a slap across a face already raw from years of humiliation. But he held his ground. I'm offering you my daughter because if I don't, the Morcants will seize my remaining estates within the month. And when that happens, Evelyne loses everything. Her home, her standing, her future. At least here she has protection. Protection. Caedric repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. You're asking the most feared man in Evelyne to protect your daughter. Do you understand the irony of that, Edmund? I understand that fear and cruelty are not the same thing. Your father was not cruel. I knew your father. Something moved behind Caedric's eyes, something quick and sharp and immediately buried. My father is dead. Yes. And the men who killed him are the same men who will destroy my family if you refuse this arrangement. Vale leaned forward. I'm not asking for mercy, Your Grace. I'm asking for a transaction. Take my daughter, settle the debt, and keep her out of Morcant's reach. Caedric was quiet for a long time. The fire cracked. Wind pressed against the study windows with a sound like something trying to get inside. Bring her in, he said finally. Garrett opened the door. The cold rushed into the room first, carrying the scent of snow and frozen salt from the cliffs. Then the sound of footsteps on stone. Then silence. Evelyne Vale stood in the doorway of Caedric Ravenshade's study, wearing a silver velvet dress that had seen better seasons. The hem was damp. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that was striking not because of its beauty, but because of its refusal to perform any expression other than absolute composure. She was younger than Caedric had expected, 20, maybe 21. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but her chin was lifted and her eyes met his without dropping. Caedric had spent 7 years watching people enter rooms. He could read a man's intentions in the way he positioned his feet. He could estimate a woman's temperament by how quickly her gaze sought the floor. Evelyne Vale's gaze did not seek the floor. It locked onto his with a directness that felt less like courage and more like a dare. Something ancient stirred in the architecture of Caedric's chest. Not warmth, not curiosity. Something more fundamental. Something that felt like recognition, though he had no framework for what was being recognized. He crushed it immediately. Do you understand why you're here? He asked. Yes. Her voice was steady, low. The trembling in her hands did not reach her throat. Your father has offered your guardianship to settle his debts. You will live in this castle under my authority until the arrangement concludes. Do you have questions? 1. Caedric raised an eyebrow. Most people did not ask him questions. Most people did not want to know the answers. Did you accept because you need something from my father, or because this arrangement amuses you? The room went very quiet. Edmund Vale made a small choking sound from his chair. Garrett, standing near the door, pressed his lips together to suppress something that might have been either alarm or admiration. Caedric studied her. The fire threw shadows across his face, turning his silver eyes into something metallic and unreadable. I accepted, he said slowly, because your father presented a problem that required a solution. Amusement has nothing to do with how I operate. Good. Evelyne held his gaze for one more second, then she looked away, toward the frost-covered window. Because I'd rather be a transaction than entertainment. Cadric said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to Garrett. "Show Miss Vale to the east chambers, the ones overlooking the sea. Have the household prepare appropriate accommodations." The east chambers? Garrett's surprise was barely concealed. Those rooms had not been occupied since Cadric's mother lived in the castle. They were the finest in Blackthorn Keep, reserved for family rather than guests. "Did I stutter?" "No, Your Grace." Evelyne left the study without looking back at her father. Edmund Vale sat motionless in his chair, his eyes wet, his hands still gripping his knees as if the chair itself were the only thing preventing him from falling apart. Kedrick waited until the footsteps faded. "Your daughter has a spine, Edmund. She gets it from her mother. Her mother is dead." "Yes, that's why the spine survived intact. Nobody was powerful enough to break it out of her." Kedrick picked up his pen and returned to the naval supply records, as if the most significant disruption to his carefully constructed existence had not just walked through his door wearing damp velvet and a refusal to flinch. But after Edmund Vale left, after the study fell silent, after the fire had burned down to embers and the whiskey remained untouched, Kedrick sat motionless in the dark for nearly an hour. He was thinking about the way she had looked at him, not with hatred, not with submission, not with the desperate calculation he saw in every face that entered this castle. She had looked at him the way someone looks at a locked door they fully intend to open. And Cadric Ravenshade, the man who had spent 7 years making himself impenetrable, felt the first hairline fracture spread through the wall he had built between himself and everything that could hurt him. He told himself it meant nothing. Within a week, he would understand that it meant everything. Evelyne Vale moved through Blackthorn Keep the way water moves through stone. Slowly, quietly, with a persistence that only became visible after the damage was already done. She followed the rules. She wore the gowns embroidered with obsidian thread that appeared in her chambers without explanation. She ate meals at the designated hour. She spoke to servants with a courtesy that confused them, because courtesy was not a currency they were accustomed to receiving. But she also did things that nobody in Blackthorn Keep had done in 7 years. She left books open on tables in rooms Caedric frequented. Their pages turned to passages about governance and mercy that felt deliberate rather than accidental. She rode through the southern gardens at exactly the hour when Caedric conducted his council meetings, and the sound of her horse's hooves on the gravel path below his window became a distraction he could not rationalize away. She read beside the fire in the great hall every evening, and the sound of pages turning in the silence became something Caedric listened for without admitting that he was listening. The household noticed. Kedric's steward, a meticulous man named Aldrich who had managed the castle's operations for 15 years, reported the changes with the clinical precision his master demanded. "Council meetings have averaged 43 minutes shorter over the past 2 weeks, Your Grace." The agenda was lighter. "The agenda was identical, sir. You simply concluded discussions faster." Kedrick looked up from his desk. "Is that a criticism?" Aldrich had survived 15 years in service to Cadric Ravenshade by knowing exactly when to speak and when to become furniture. He chose furniture. "No, Your Grace. Merely an observation." "Keep your observations to operational matters, Aldrich. My schedule is not an operational matter." "Of course, sir." But the schedule told its own story. Executions that had once been carried out with indifferent regularity were delayed, rescheduled, delayed again. The bells that announced them, the ones that echoed across Blackthorn Keep's courtyards, with a finality that made even hardened soldiers uncomfortable, rang less frequently. The official explanation was administrative restructuring. The actual reason was that Caedric had noticed Evelyne's face when the bells rang, the way her jaw tightened, the way her hand stilled on whatever book she was holding, the way she did not flinch but also did not breathe. He was not doing it for her. He told himself that with the same conviction he applied to every lie he needed to believe. He was simply optimizing his governance approach. The bells were disruptive. The executions could be managed differently. The fact that this optimization coincided exactly with the arrival of a woman who made him uncomfortable was a correlation, not a causation. Garrett saw through it immediately. "You stopped drinking alone," Garrett said one evening, finding Caedric in the great hall rather than his study. "I didn't stop. I relocated. To the room where she reads every night. It's the warmest room in the castle. It's the warmest room in the castle because you ordered double firewood for it 3 days after she arrived. Cadrick's jaw tightened. Garrett, I'm not judging Cadrick. I'm warning. The court is watching. They always watch. And what they see right now is a man who hasn't shown vulnerability in 7 years suddenly restructuring his entire routine around a woman who arrived as a debt payment. She is a ward of this house. Her comfort is my responsibility. Her comfort, yes. Your obsession with providing it, no. The word landed like a blade between them. Obsession. Cadrick turned to face his oldest advisor with an expression that had preceded the destruction of families, the collapse of estates, the silence that fell over rooms when men realized they had pushed exactly one word too far. Choose your next sentence very carefully, Cadrick said. Garrett did not flinch. He was perhaps the only man alive who could absorb that look and remain standing. The Morcants are already talking. Celine arrived in the capital last week. She's been making visits, hosting dinners, asking questions about Evelyne, about her background, about why the Duke of Ravenshade gave a bankrupt man's daughter the finest chambers in his castle. Garrett paused. You know what happens when they smell weakness. Evelyne Vale is not my weakness. Then stop acting like she is. Cadrick held Garrett's gaze for a long, terrible moment. The fire cracked. Somewhere in the castle, a door closed. Then Cadrick turned back to the fire, and his shoulders carried a tension that Garrett had never seen before, a tension that looked less like anger and more like a man holding two halves of himself together through sheer force of will. I know what I'm doing, Cadrick said quietly. Garrett looked at him, at the firelight cutting across his profile, at the way his eyes tracked toward the empty chair where Evelyne usually sat, before redirecting themselves to the flames. I believe you think you do, Garrett replied, and left. The royal banquet at Thornwall Palace arrived 6 weeks later, and with it, the first public confrontation that would crack the careful surface Cadrick had maintained since Evelyne's arrival. The great hall at Thornwall blazed with candlelight. Hundreds of candles mounted in iron chandeliers that threw shifting gold across marble floors, silk gowns, military dress coats, and the calculated smiles of Evelyne's most powerful families. Music drifted from the gallery above, strings and woodwinds weaving through the noise of 300 conversations happening simultaneously, each one a negotiation disguised as small talk. Cadrick entered with Evelyne at his side. She wore black silk with dark silver threading, a gown that his household had prepared without his explicit instruction, but with the unspoken understanding that the Duke's ward would represent Blackthorn Keep, whether he acknowledged it or not. Her hair was braided and pinned, exposing the line of her throat and the sharp architecture of her collarbones. She looked severe, composed. Nothing like the trembling woman who had arrived in damp velvet weeks ago. The room noticed. Conversations dimmed, eyes tracked, fans opened and closed like signals being passed across a battlefield. Cadrick guided her through the crowd with one hand resting against the small of her back, a gesture so minimal it could be interpreted as courtesy rather than possession. But the nobles of Evelyne were trained to read gestures the way scholars read manuscripts, extracting meaning from every stroke. They saw possession. Lady Celine Morcant waited near the center of the hall, positioned beneath the largest chandelier with the precision of a woman who understood that lighting was a weapon. Celine was 30, elegant in a predatory way that reminded Cadrick of the ornamental knives displayed in his father's war room. Beautiful to look at, designed to open veins. The crown expected him to marry her. The Morcant family expected it. Half the kingdom expected it. Celine herself carried the expectation like a title she had already claimed. She intercepted them near the wine tables, her smile as sharp as broken glass. Your Grace, she inclined her head to Cadrick, then turned her gaze to Evelyne with the slow, appraising sweep of someone cataloging deficiencies. And this must be the famous ward. I've heard so many interesting things about you, Miss Vale. Your father was once quite respected, wasn't he? Before the debts, I mean. Evelyne's expression did not change. He still is. Respect isn't something creditors can collect. Something flickered across Celine's face. Surprise, quickly buried beneath amusement. How charming! A wit sharpened by adversity. Celine raised her voice just enough for the surrounding nobles to hear. Tell me, Miss Vale, is it true that your guardianship was transferred as payment? Because I must confess, the arrangement strikes me as rather medieval, even for the Duke of Ravenshade. The circle of nobles around them went still. This was the moment. The opening salvo of a campaign that Celine had clearly rehearsed, and every eye in the vicinity understood what was happening. A public humiliation designed to establish Evelyne's place, or rather, her lack of one, in the hierarchy of Edivaine's court. Evelyne opened her mouth to respond. Cedric spoke first. "Lady Celine." His voice carried no heat, no anger, nothing but the flat, controlled register that men who had negotiated with him recognized as the sound preceding catastrophic consequences. "I'd be careful about questioning the arrangements of my household in public. The last person who did that now manages a grain warehouse in the southern provinces. I hear the work is honest, if unremarkable." Celine's smile hardened. "I meant no offense, Your Grace, merely curiosity." "Curiosity is a privilege reserved for those who can afford the answers." He picked up a glass of wine from the table without breaking eye contact. "I don't recall you being in that position." The silence around them had weight, physical, suffocating weight. Nobles who had been pretending not to listen abandoned the pretense entirely. Celine Morcant stood perfectly still, her face composed, but her eyes burned with something far more dangerous than embarrassment. She had been warned, publicly, by the man she intended to marry, over a woman she intended to destroy. The banquet continued. Music resumed. Conversations restarted with the forced brightness of people pretending they had not just witnessed the opening move of a war that would reshape Edivaine's political landscape. But the night was not finished. 3 hours later, after the dancing had reached its peak and the wine had loosened the restraints that protocol demanded, Celine found her moment. She waited until Cedric was pulled into a strategic conversation with 2 military advisors near the eastern alcove. Then she approached Evelyne, who stood alone near the gallery staircase, and delivered the words that would detonate across the entire hall. "You know what you are, don't you?" Celine's voice was soft enough to sound intimate, but calibrated to carry exactly far enough. "You're not a ward, you're not a guest. You're a purchased mistress hiding behind stolen nobility, and every person in this room knows it." Evelyne went white, not from shame, from something deeper and more volatile, from the collision between the composure she had maintained for weeks and the raw, unprocessed reality of her situation hitting her in the most public arena possible. She said nothing. Her silence was not agreement. It was the silence of someone deciding whether to break something or someone. But the damage was already spreading. Whispers moved through the hall like fire through dry grass. Purchased mistress. The phrase repeated and mutated and gained momentum until it reached the eastern alcove where Cedric Ravenshade stood mid-sentence with 2 men who suddenly found their wine glasses extremely interesting. Cedric heard it. The exact words. Repeated by someone 3 feet to his left who did not realize the Duke was listening. He set his wine glass down. He crossed the hall. Every step was measured, controlled. The crowd parted without being asked, because something in his movement communicated a force that made standing in its path physically inadvisable. He reached the center of the room. He stopped. He picked up a crystal wine glass from the nearest table, held it in his black-gloved hand, and squeezed. The glass shattered. Shards fell to the marble floor. Blood welled through the leather of his glove, dripping in slow red drops that hit the white stone with sounds that were somehow louder than the music, louder than the voices, louder than anything in the hall. 300 people stopped breathing. "She belongs beside me." Cedric's voice filled the room the way cold fills an empty house. Total. Inescapable. Anyone who questions it challenges House Ravenshade itself. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Celine Morcant stood 6 feet away, her face the color of ivory, her hands clenched at her sides. Cedric turned to Evelyne. Blood still dripped from his glove. His expression was impossible to read, a surface so controlled it could have been carved from the same marble beneath his feet. "We're leaving," he said. They walked out of Thornwall Palace together, through the great doors and into the frozen night, and 300 nobles watched them go in a silence so complete that the sound of Evelyne's heels on marble became the only heartbeat in the room. In the carriage back to Blackthorn Keep, neither spoke. Evelyne stared through the frosted window at the dark countryside sliding past. Cadric sat across from her, his injured hand resting on his knee, blood soaking slowly through the leather. He had not allowed anyone to examine it. Finally, 20 minutes into the ride, Evelyne broke the silence. "You shouldn't have done that." "I know. You just declared war on the Morcant family in front of the entire court." "I'm aware." "Why?" Cadric looked at her. In the dim lamplight of the carriage, his silver eyes carried something she had not seen before, something that looked dangerously close to honesty. "Because she was wrong," he said, "and I don't tolerate lies spoken in my presence, regardless of who speaks them." Evelyne studied him. The blood on his glove, the rigid set of his jaw, the way he held himself perfectly still, as if stillness were the only barrier between the person he presented to the world and something far more volatile underneath. "You're bleeding," she said. "It doesn't matter." "It does to me." The carriage rocked over a frozen rut in the road. Cadric's eyes stayed on hers. For one unguarded second, the mask slipped. Underneath was not the iron ruler, or the calculated strategist, or the most feared man in Evelyne. Underneath was exhaustion, pure and total. Then the mask returned, and Cadric looked away, and the carriage continued through the snow toward Blackthorn Keep, where guards stood at every gate and candles burned in every corridor, and the West Wing remained locked against questions that Evelyne was only beginning to understand she needed to ask. 2 weeks later, a sealed letter arrived at Blackthorn Keep bearing the Morcant family crest. Garrett brought it to Cadric's study at dawn. Cadric read it once, set it down, and stared through the window at the frozen sea for a long time. "What does it say?" Garrett asked. "Celine has petitioned the Crown to review the legality of Evelyne's guardianship. She's arguing that the arrangement constitutes unlawful debt bondage under the Royal Charter of 1402. If the petition succeeds, Evelyne will be removed from Blackthorn Keep and placed under Crown custody." Crown custody meaning Morcant custody. Obviously. "And then?" Cadric turned from the window. His face was calm. His voice was steady, but his hands, resting on the desk, had curled into fists so tight that the tendons stood out like cables beneath his skin. "Then they use her against me, as leverage, as a hostage, as proof that the Duke of Ravenshade can be controlled through something other than force." He paused. "I will not allow that." "What are you going to do?" Cadric reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a leather folder that Garrett had never seen before. Inside were documents, maps, correspondence, and a list of names written in Cadric's own hand, each one annotated with dates, locations, and a single word that Garrett recognized with a chill that started at the base of his skull and spread downward. The word was evidence. "I'm going to do what I should have done 2 years ago," Cadric said quietly. "I'm going to open the West Wing." He looked up, and in his silver eyes burned something that was not anger, not fear, not calculation. It was finality. "Get Evelyne. There's something she needs to see." Garrett did not move. "Cadric, if you show her what's in there, there's no going back. She becomes part of this, part of everything you've been building in the dark for 7 years. I know. She didn't choose this." "Neither did I." Cadric's voice cracked. Just barely. Just enough for Garrett to hear the fault line running through the center of the man he had watched grow from a grieving boy into something the kingdom would rather not name. "But she's already in it, Garrett. The moment Celine spoke her name in that hall, Evelyne became a target. The only question now is whether she faces what's coming with the truth or without it." Garrett stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned toward the door. Behind him, Cadric Ravenshade sat alone in his study, surrounded by 7 years of meticulously documented vengeance, and pressed his hand flat against the desk to stop it from shaking. Somewhere beyond the study walls, footsteps echoed through the corridor. Evelyne was coming, and the West Wing, sealed for 7 years against the weight of murdered fathers and broken bloodlines and a truth so dangerous it could collapse the monarchy itself, was about to open. The West Wing smelled like old paper and cold stone, and something faintly metallic that Evelyne could not identify until she realized it was the residue of ink, thousands of pages worth, saturating the air the way blood saturates bandages. Cadric walked ahead of her carrying a single candle. its flame throwing his shadow across walls that had not seen light in years. The corridor was narrow, deliberately so, built during an era when the Ravenshade family designed their private quarters to be defensible rather than comfortable. Every door they passed was locked. Every window was shuttered from the inside with iron bolts that had rusted into permanence. Garrett followed 3 steps behind Evelyne. He had not spoken since collecting her from the East Chambers 20 minutes ago. His silence carried the particular weight of a man who understood that the next hour would alter the trajectory of multiple lives and had decided that commentary would only cheapen the gravity of what was about to unfold. Kedrick stopped at the final door. It was different from the others, reinforced with iron banding. 3 separate locks, each requiring a different key. He produced them from a chain around his neck that Evelyne had never noticed before, hidden beneath his collar, resting against his chest like a second heartbeat made of metal. He unlocked the door without ceremony. The room beyond was large, larger than Evelyne expected. It had once been a private study, or perhaps a war council chamber, built with high ceilings and stone walls now covered entirely in documents. Maps, letters, diagrams of family trees with names connected by lines in different colors, red for alliance, black for betrayal, gray for dead. A massive oak table dominated the center, buried under ledgers, sealed correspondence, and what appeared to be transcripts of private conversations recorded by sources whose identities were marked only with numbers rather than names. Evelyne stepped inside and felt the room close around her like a confession. 7 years, Kedrick said. He set the candle on the table and began lighting others from a box near the wall. As each flame caught, more of the room revealed itself, and with each revelation, the scope of what Kedrick had built in secret became more staggering. 7 years of documentation, every meeting, every transaction, every letter intercepted, copied, and returned before the seal cooled. This is what the West Wing contains, Evelyne. Not a dead woman's ghost, not some romantic tragedy preserved in amber. This, he gestured at the walls with a hand that was perfectly steady. Evidence. Evelyne moved toward the nearest wall. Her fingers hovered above a map of Edivaine's eastern provinces, covered in annotations so dense they resembled a language unto themselves. Trade routes marked with dates, names circled in red with notations indicating financial transfers. A timeline running along the bottom edge that began with a single entry 7 years ago. Father. Dinner. Poison confirmed. Her breath caught. You documented everything. Everything I could verify. I don't deal in suspicion. Suspicion is what weak men use to justify acting on fear. I needed certainty, the kind that holds up when men with titles and armies try to tear it apart. And this is what you've been doing. Every night, behind the locked doors. Every night for 7 years. While the kingdom thought I was drinking myself into irrelevance or brooding over my father's memory like some damaged heir playing at morning. While the Morcants consolidated power and the crown looked the other way, because looking toward the truth would have cost them allies they couldn't afford to lose. Kedrick's voice carried no self-pity. It carried the flat precision of a man reciting operational facts. I let them underestimate me. I let them think grief had made me reckless, and isolation had made me brittle. And while they were busy being certain about who I was busy becoming something they didn't have a contingency for. Evelyne turned from the wall. The candlelight caught her face at an angle that stripped away the composure she had maintained since arriving at Blackthorn Keep. Underneath was not fear. It was the raw, disoriented expression of someone whose understanding of reality had just been dismantled and rebuilt in the space of 30 seconds. You're not just defending your title, she said. You're building a case against the crown's own allies. Against the men who murdered my father and spent 7 years pretending they didn't. Lord Selwyn Morcant orchestrated the coup. His daughter Celine manages the political apparatus that keeps the conspiracy buried. The crown benefits from their influence and therefore has no incentive to investigate, which means the only path to justice runs through exposure so complete and so public that denial becomes more expensive than accountability. That's not justice, Kedrick. That's a detonation. Yes. He looked at her directly. It is. The room was quiet except for the sound of candle flames eating oxygen and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs beneath the castle. Evelyne stood surrounded by 7 years of meticulously organized rage and felt something shift inside her understanding of the man who had created it. She had assumed Caedric Ravenshade was cold, that his precision was a personality trait rather than a survival mechanism, that the walls he built around himself were constructed from arrogance rather than necessity. She had been wrong. The walls were not arrogance, they were architecture. Load-bearing structures designed to support the weight of a truth so dangerous that carrying it alone for 7 years should have crushed him. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Caedric did not answer immediately. He stood on the opposite side of the table, both hands resting on the oak surface, and for the first time since she had known him, his posture did not communicate authority. It communicated something closer to exhaustion, held upright through habit. "Because Celine filed a petition to remove you from my custody. If it succeeds, you'll be transferred to Crown jurisdiction, which means Morcant jurisdiction. They'll use you as leverage. They'll threaten your safety to force my compliance, and if I comply, everything in this room becomes worthless. 7 years of work, destroyed, because I allowed someone close enough to become a vulnerability." His voice did not crack, but his fingers pressed harder against the table, and the tendons in his forearms stood rigid beneath his rolled sleeves. "You deserve to know what you're standing inside of. What staying in this castle actually means. Because staying means you're no longer a ward, Evelyne. You're a witness. And witnesses in Evelyne have a very short life expectancy when the people they can testify against control the courts." Evelyne absorbed this. She absorbed it the way she had absorbed every piece of devastating information that had been delivered to her since childhood. Her father's bankruptcy, her mother's death, the carriage ride through the snow to a castle owned by a man the kingdom called a monster. She absorbed it by refusing to let it dictate her next action. "So my options are leave and become a hostage, or stay and become a target." Yes, those aren't options, Caedric. Those are different ways of being destroyed. "Welcome to the aristocracy." Something close to a laugh escaped her. Not humor. Something darker and more involuntary. The sound a person makes when the absurdity of their situation exceeds the capacity of any other response. "You could have told me this without bringing me here, without showing me all of this. A conversation in the study would have been sufficient. A conversation in the study would have given you information. This gives you understanding. There's a difference. The difference being that now I can't pretend I don't know." "Exactly." Evelyne looked at him across the table, across the documentation of 7 years of vengeance, across the accumulated evidence of a man who had turned his grief into a weapon so precise that its targets did not know they were already dead. "You're asking me to trust you," she said. "I'm asking you to make a decision with complete information. Trust is your business. I've never asked anyone to trust me. Because you don't trust anyone yourself. Because trust is a debt I can't afford to owe. Every person I've trusted has either died or betrayed me. The mathematics are not encouraging. And yet you brought me into this room." Caedric said nothing. His silence filled the space between them with something that felt more honest than any words he had spoken since her arrival. Because she was right. He had brought her into the one room in Blackthorn Keep that contained every secret he possessed, every vulnerability, every piece of evidence that, if destroyed, would erase 7 years of work and leave him defenseless against enemies who would not hesitate to finish what they started. He had handed a woman he had known for weeks the ability to annihilate him, and he could not explain why. Not to her, not to Garrett, not to himself. The calculation did not work. The mathematics he relied on to navigate every other decision in his life produced no coherent answer for why he had unlocked 3 doors, walked Evelyne Vale into the architecture of his most dangerous secret, and stood across from her waiting for a response that could determine whether he survived the next 6 months. Something inside him, something buried so deep beneath 7 years of armor that he had forgotten it existed, had made the decision before his strategic mind could intervene. The same something that had given her the East Chambers, that had shortened council meetings, that had silenced the execution bells, that had shattered a crystal glass in his bare hand in front of 300 nobles because a woman with a calculated smile had called Evelyne a purchased mistress. He did not have a name for it. Naming it would make it real, and making it real would make it targetable, and anything targetable could be destroyed. So he stood in silence and waited. Evelyne walked around the table. She moved slowly, studying the documents as she passed, her fingers trailing along the edge of the oak without touching the papers. She stopped when she reached his side, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender that clung to the gowns his household provided, close enough that the candlelight caught the slight tremor in her lower lip that she had been hiding since entering the room. "I'll stay," she said. "You understand what that means. I understand that the alternative is worse, and I understand something else you haven't said out loud." She looked up at him. "You didn't bring me here because you needed a witness, Kedrick. You brought me here because you needed someone to know, all of it, the weight of it. Because carrying it alone for 7 years has done something to you that you can't fix by yourself, and you're terrified of admitting that, so you've framed it as strategic necessity instead." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Evelyne had ever heard. Kedrick's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath his left eye. His breathing, always controlled, always measured, became fractionally uneven, and for one raw second his silver eyes held something that looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to step forward or back. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't try to find something human in this. You'll be disappointed." "I'm already looking at it," she replied, "whether you want me to or not." He turned away. Not sharply, not dramatically, with the slow, deliberate movement of someone removing themselves from a proximity that had become dangerous. He walked to the far wall and stood with his back to her, one hand pressed flat against the stone, his head slightly bowed. Garrett, who had watched the entire exchange from the doorway without breathing, looked at Evelyne. She met his gaze. Something passed between them that did not require words. An acknowledgement, a warning, a recognition that what they had just witnessed was not a strategic briefing. It was a fracture. And fractures, once they begin, do not stop until the structure either heals or collapses entirely. 4 weeks after the West Wing revelation, the political machinery Kedrick had anticipated began moving with the oiled precision of a trap designed by someone who understood that the best prisons were built from procedure rather than stone. Celine Morcant's petition reached the Crown Judiciary on a Tuesday. By Thursday, 3 separate legal scholars had published opinions supporting her argument that Evelyne's guardianship constituted unlawful bondage. By the following Monday, the Crown had issued a formal inquiry, requesting that Evelyne Vale present herself before a judicial tribunal in the capital within 30 days. The speed was deliberate, designed to prevent Kedrick from building a legal defense, designed to force a reactive posture from a man who had spent 7 years refusing to react to anything. Kedrick read the summons in his study at 6 in the morning. His face showed nothing. His hands showed nothing. But when Garrett entered the room 10 minutes later, every candle had been extinguished except one, and Kedrick sat in near darkness with the document flat on his desk, both palms pressed against the paper as if holding it down would prevent what it contained from becoming real. "They moved faster than I projected," Kedrick said. "How fast did you project?" 6 weeks. They did it in 4, which means Celine has someone inside the judiciary I haven't identified. Someone with enough influence to accelerate proceedings without leaving a procedural trail. Do we comply? If we comply, Evelyne enters Crown jurisdiction. The tribunal will rule against us because the tribunal is stacked with Morcant allies. She gets transferred to a supervised residence in the capital, which means Morcant surveillance, which means anything she knows about the West Wing becomes extractable through pressure I don't want to imagine. If we refuse to comply, the Crown brands us in contempt, which gives them legal authority to send armed forces to extract her. So either way, they get what they want. Either way, they get what they want through legal channels, which is exactly what Celine designed. She's not attacking me with soldiers, she's attacking me with paperwork. Because she knows I can fight an army, but I can't fight a legal system that was built to protect the people trying to destroy me. Garrett leaned against the doorframe. His expression carried the worn patience of a man who had watched Kedrick navigate impossible situations for years and had learned that the most dangerous moments were not the ones that produced anger, but the ones that produced quiet. This was quiet. "There's a third option," Garrett said carefully. "I know what the third option is." "Do you?" "Release the evidence. All of it. Every document. Every transcript. Every financial record linking the Morcant family to the assassination of my father and the corruption of the Crown judiciary. Make it so public and so devastating that the tribunal collapses under the weight of its own illegitimacy before it can issue a ruling. That's the nuclear option, Keodric. I'm aware of the metaphor. It's not a metaphor. You release that evidence now, before you've finished building the case, before you've identified every conspirator, before you've secured the alliances needed to survive the fallout, and you don't just expose the Morcants. You expose the Crown's complicity. You expose every noble family that looked the other way. You turn the entire political establishment of Evelyne into your enemy simultaneously. They're already my enemy. The only difference is whether they're my enemy in the dark or my enemy in the light. In the dark, you control the timeline. In the light, they control the reaction. Keodric stood. He moved to the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Below, the frozen sea churned against the cliffs with a violence that matched nothing in his external demeanor and everything in the space behind his ribs. "She asked me something in the West Wing," he said. His voice had dropped to a register Garrett had heard perhaps 3 times in 7 years. "She asked why I brought her there. And I gave her a strategic answer because that's what I do. I reduce everything to strategy because strategy is controllable, and controllable things can't hurt you." He paused. "But that wasn't why I brought her there." Garrett said nothing. He recognized this moment the way a physician recognizes the instant before a fever breaks. Not with relief, with the understanding that what followed would be either recovery or collapse, and that the difference between the two was entirely outside his control. "I brought her there because when she looks at me, she doesn't see the Duke. She doesn't see the reputation or the fear or the 7 years of calculated brutality that I built between myself and everything that could damage me. She sees the damage itself, and instead of using it against me, she just stands there, looking at it, like it doesn't terrify her. Does that change the calculation? It destroys the calculation. Every equation I've built since my father's death has one foundational assumption, that I operate alone. That isolation is not a cost, but a structural requirement. That the moment I allow someone to matter, I create a vulnerability that my enemies will exploit. And that assumption has kept me alive for 7 years." He turned from the window. "But she matters, Garrett. She matters. And I can't undo it. And I can't strategize around it. And I can't reduce it to an equation that produces a manageable outcome. She has taken up residence inside the one part of me that I thought I had permanently shut down. And I don't know whether that makes me stronger or whether it just means I've finally given the Morcants exactly what they need to finish what they started." Garrett looked at the man he had watched grow from a shattered boy into the most feared ruler in Evelyne, and for the first time in their long association, he saw both versions simultaneously. The boy who had stood in a frozen courtyard watching his family name get chiseled off stone. The man who had rebuilt that name through precision and controlled violence and the absolute refusal to need anyone or anything beyond his own will. Both versions stood in the study. Both were terrified. The boy because he remembered what love cost. The man because he had just admitted he was paying it anyway. "Then protect her," Garrett said simply. "Not because the strategy requires it, because you choose to. And if that means releasing the evidence before you're ready, then you accept the consequences and you fight the war that comes. But you stop pretending that the reason you're fighting is political." "If I stop pretending, I lose the only advantage I have, the advantage of appearing to operate without sentiment. You lost that advantage in Thornwall when you shattered a wine glass in front of 300 people. The kingdom already knows, Keodric. The only person still being deceived is you." Keodric stared at him. The candle on his desk flickered. Shadows moved across the walls of the study like something alive and restless. Then he sat down. He opened the leather folder. He began writing. "Summon the household captains. I want the castle at full defensive readiness within 48 hours. Recall every intelligence contact in the eastern provinces. I need a complete assessment of Morcant military strength, garrison positions, and supply lines by the end of the week." "You're preparing for war." "I'm preparing for what happens after I send the evidence to every noble house, every judicial authority, and every foreign embassy in Evelyne simultaneously." Garrett straightened. "When?" "Before the tribunal date, 30 days. I need 20 to prepare. That gives me 10 days of margin for the inevitable complications." And Evelyne? Cadrick's pen stopped. His hand rested on the paper. The ink pooled beneath the nib, forming a small dark circle that spread outward like a bruise. Evelyne stays. She knows the truth. She chose to stay knowing the truth. I will not insult that choice by making it for her. And if the worst happens? If the evidence isn't enough? If the Crown sides with the Morcants despite everything? Kedrick looked up. His silver eyes held something that Garrett had never seen in them before. Not rage. Not calculation. Not the cold precision that had defined every decision for 7 years. Resolve. The kind that does not calculate odds because it has already accepted every possible outcome and decided that none of them matter more than the principle at the center. Then I burn it all down, Kedrick said. Every alliance, every asset, every advantage I've built. I burn it down and I take them with me, because I would rather be destroyed standing in the truth than survive inside a lie that requires me to sacrifice the only person who has ever looked at me and seen something worth saving. Garrett held his gaze. Then he nodded. Once. I'll summon the captains. He left the study. The door closed. And Kedrick Ravenshade sat alone with 20 days to prepare for the detonation of everything he had built and everything he had become. Somewhere below the castle, the sea hammered the black cliffs. Above, in the east chambers, Evelyne Vale stood at her window, watching the first gray light of dawn spread across the water. She did not know about the summons yet. She did not know about the 20-day timeline, or the military preparations, or the decision that Kedrick had just made in the room below her feet. But she knew something had shifted. She could feel it in the rhythm of the castle, in the way the guards moved, in the way the servants spoke in shorter sentences with wider eyes. Blackthorn Keep was holding its breath, and when the letter arrived at her door that same morning, sealed with the Ravenshade crest and containing a single line in Kedrick's handwriting, she understood why. The line read, "Stay close. What comes next changes everything." Evelyne folded the letter. She pressed it against her chest. She closed her eyes. And outside the windows of Blackthorn Keep, far to the south, where the frost-covered roads connected the northern territory to the capital, a column of armored riders bearing the Morcant crest had already begun moving north. Not a judicial delegation, not a legal envoy. Soldiers, 600 of them. And they were not coming to deliver a summons. They were coming to take her. Garrett saw the column first. He was on the north watchtower running a routine inspection of the signal relay stations when the morning fog thinned enough to reveal the southern road. 600 riders moving in tight formation, the Morcant crest visible on their banners even at 3 miles distance. Not a diplomatic envoy. Diplomatic envoys traveled in groups of 12 with ceremonial guards and enough luggage to furnish a small estate. This was a military column. Heavy cavalry in the front ranks, supply wagons trailing behind. The kind of formation designed to arrive at a destination and stay there until the objective was achieved or everything around it was ash. Garrett descended the watchtower stairs faster than his damaged knee should have allowed and crossed the courtyard at a pace that made 2 stable hands stop what they were doing and stare. He found Kedrick in the armory, standing before a rack of cavalry swords with his arms crossed and his head tilted slightly, the posture of a man studying a problem rather than selecting a weapon. 600 Morcant riders on the southern road, Garrett said. 3 miles out, moving at campaign speed. They'll reach the outer perimeter within the hour. Kedrick did not turn. His eyes stayed on the swords. How many supply wagons? 8 that I counted. 8 wagons for 600 men. That's 3 days of provisions at standard rationing. They're not planning a siege. They're planning an extraction. Quick insertion, secure the target, withdraw before I can mount a coordinated response. The target being Evelyne. The target being the only piece of leverage that makes their legal strategy unnecessary. Kedrick finally turned. His face was composed, but his eyes had shifted into the register that Garrett privately called operational. The look that preceded decisions measured in consequences rather than minutes. They skipped the tribunal. They skipped the legal process entirely, which means Celine convinced her father that waiting 30 days was more dangerous than acting now. Or it means they found out about the West Wing. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which Kedrick's expression did not change, but something behind it recalculated every assumption he had built his 20-day timeline around. That's not possible. 3 people know about the West Wing: you, me, Evelyne, and the household staff who maintain the corridors. The corridors, not the rooms. The doors stay locked. The keys stay on my person. Nobody enters without me. Then how did they know to move early? Your timeline assumed 6 weeks for the petition. They did it in 4. Your adjusted timeline assumed 30 days before military action. They're here in 12. Someone is feeding them information about your operational tempo, Kaedric. Not the specifics, the rhythm. And only someone inside this castle has access to your rhythm. Kaedric's jaw tightened. A muscle in his neck corded and released. His hands, hanging at his sides, curled slowly into fists that he held for 3 beats before deliberately opening them again, finger by finger, as if rehearsing control over a body that wanted very badly to break something. Seal the castle, full defensive protocol. Every gate, every passage, every drainage culvert that connects to the exterior. I want the garrison at battle stations within 20 minutes. And the evidence? If they breach the walls and reach the West Wing, everything burns. Move the critical documents to the Sea Vault. Take Aldrich and 2 men you trust with your life. Not men you trust professionally. Men whose loyalty survives the scenario where following my orders might get them killed. That narrows the field considerably. I know. Move. Garrett moved. Kaedric stood alone in the armory for another 15 seconds. His breathing was measured, even. The breathing of a man who had trained himself to treat crisis as data rather than experience. But underneath that training, in the spaces between breaths, something was fracturing. The 20-day timeline was gone. The careful, methodical approach he had spent 7 years perfecting was gone. The Morcants were not playing his game anymore. They were playing a different game entirely, one built on speed and force, and the understanding that legal pretense was only necessary when you intended to leave your opponent alive long enough to contest the outcome. They were not coming to argue. They were coming to take. And Kaedric Ravenshade, who had survived 7 years by controlling every variable within his reach, was about to discover what happened when the variables started controlling him. He chose a sword from the rack, not the ceremonial blade mounted on the wall, a working weapon, plain hilt, balanced steel, the kind of sword that existed for utility rather than display. He belted it at his hip and walked out of the armory toward the east wing. Evelyne was already awake. She stood in the center of her chambers wearing the gray riding dress she favored for mornings. Her hair loose, a book open on the table beside her that she had clearly not been reading. Her face told him she already knew. I heard the watchtower bell, she said. 600 riders. Morcant forces. They'll be here within the hour. The tribunal isn't for another 18 days. They've abandoned the tribunal. This is a direct action. They're coming for you. Evelyne absorbed this. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. But her eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes that had looked at Kaedric in the West Wing and seen through 7 years of armor as if it were gauze, carried something new. Not fear. Something past fear. The cold recognition of a person who has run out of room to maneuver and knows it. What do you need me to do? Stay inside the castle. Stay away from the walls and the gates. If the outer defenses fall, Garrett will bring you to the Sea Vault. There's a passage that connects to the cove below the cliffs. A boat will be waiting. And you? I'll be on the walls. That's not what I asked. Kaedric looked at her. The morning light from the window caught the silver in his eyes and turned it translucent. For one unguarded second, his face held the expression of a man calculating whether honesty would help or destroy the person standing in front of him. I'll be on the walls, he repeated. That's where I belong when people come to take what's mine. Evelyne held his gaze. Something moved between them that neither acknowledged and neither dismissed. Then she nodded once, and Kaedric left the room, and the door closed behind him with a sound that felt more permanent than wood and iron should allow. The Morcant column reached Blackthorn Keep's outer perimeter at 9:42 in the morning. They halted 600 yards from the main gate, in a formation that communicated professional discipline and absolute confidence. A single rider separated from the front rank and approached the gate under a white standard. Kaedric watched from the battlements. Garrison Captain Merrick Hale, Garrett's nephew, and a competent officer who had earned his post through aptitude rather than family connection, stood beside him. "The rider carries a crown writ," Merrick said, squinting through the distance. "Sealed document, red ribbon. That's judiciary formatting. It's a seizure order. They'll claim legal authority to enter the castle and remove Evelyne under Crown mandate. The writ will be genuine because the Morcants own enough judiciary officials to produce legitimate documentation for illegitimate actions. Do we honor it? We honor it the way we honor every document presented by men who arrive with 600 soldiers to enforce a piece of paper. We read it, we acknowledge its existence, and then we explain that Blackthorn Keep does not accept military enforcement of civilian legal matters, per the Territorial Sovereignty Compact of 1397. They'll say the compact is superseded by Crown authority. And I'll say Crown authority requires parliamentary ratification for military deployment on sovereign territory, which they don't have because getting it would have required explaining to Parliament why 600 soldiers are needed to collect one woman from a duke's castle. The legal framework is on our side, Merrick. The question is whether they care about the legal framework or whether they're counting on the fact that nobody will investigate the legality of their actions if those actions succeed. The rider reached the gate. Cadric descended to the courtyard and met him in the space between the inner and outer portcullis, a deliberate choice of location that communicated neither welcome nor hostility, but the controlled neutrality of a man negotiating from a fortified position. The rider was young, mid-20s, clean uniform, nervous hands. He had been selected for this task because he was expendable enough to risk and presentable enough to make the delivery look official rather than hostile. "Your Grace?" The rider dismounted and extended the sealed document with both hands. "I carry a writ of judicial extraction issued by the Crown Court of Evelyne, authorizing the removal of Miss Evelyne Vale from your custody and her transfer to Crown-supervised residence pending tribunal review." Kedrick took the document. He broke the seal. He read it. His face showed nothing. The courtyard around him was silent except for wind and the distant sound of 600 horses shifting weight on the road beyond the walls. "This writ was issued 3 days ago," Kedrick said. "Yes, Your Grace. 3 days ago, your column was already in motion, which means the writ was drafted after the deployment order, not before. The military action preceded the legal authorization. Do you understand what that means?" The rider swallowed. "I was instructed to deliver the document, Your Grace, not to discuss its origins. It means the men who sent you decided to take her before they bothered asking permission. The writ is a costume, a legal uniform draped over an illegal action to make it look presentable." Kedrick folded the document and placed it inside his coat. "Tell your commander that Blackthorn Keep acknowledges receipt of the writ and declines compliance under the Territorial Sovereignty Compact. Any attempt to enter this castle by force will be treated as an act of military aggression against a sovereign estate and responded to accordingly. Your Grace, the commander has authorization to use necessary force to execute the writ. Then the commander should understand that necessary force applied against Blackthorn Keep historically results in outcomes that are unfavorable for the people applying it. Dismissed." The rider remounted. His horse was skittish. The animal could feel the tension radiating from every stone surface in the courtyard, from every guard standing motionless along the walls, from the man standing in the portcullis gap whose voice carried no anger and no fear, and nothing at all except the absolute certainty of someone who had been preparing for this moment since the day his father died. The rider left, the portcullis descended, and Caedric stood in the courtyard calculating the mathematics of a siege he had 20 days to prepare for and 12 hours to execute. The first assault came at sundown. Not a full attack, a probing action. 50 riders against the eastern gate, testing response times and defensive positioning. Kedrick's garrison responded with disciplined efficiency. Crossbow volleys from the battlements forced the riders to withdraw within 8 minutes, leaving 4 wounded horses and 0 casualties on either side. It was a message, not a battle. The Morcants were communicating that they had the numbers and the willingness to use them. Kedrick was communicating that numbers alone were insufficient against prepared defenses and a commander who did not bluff. The night settled over Blackthorn Keep with the oppressive weight of a held breath. Torches burned along every wall. Guards rotated at double frequency. The castle's corridors hummed with the particular energy of a household that understood violence was no longer theoretical. At 11 that night, Kedrick was in his study reviewing defensive deployments when Aldrich appeared in the doorway. The steward's face was gray, not the gray of exhaustion or fear, but the gray of a man carrying information that he knew would cause damage and could not find a way to soften. "Your Grace, there's a situation in the West Wing." Kedrick looked up. His pen stopped. "The West Wing is sealed. Garrett moved the critical documents to the sea vault 4 hours ago." "The documents were moved, sir, but the room itself was accessed during the transfer. One of the men assisting Garrett, a soldier named Harlan Voss. He was seen by a kitchen servant entering the West Wing corridor alone approximately 90 minutes after the document transfer was complete." "Entering. Or leaving." Aldrich's gray face became grayer. "Leaving, Your Grace, with a satchel." The pen in Kedrick's hand snapped. The sound was small, insignificant. The sound of a wooden shaft breaking between fingers that had tightened beyond the threshold of the material's tolerance. Ink bled across his knuckles, like a dark wound. "Where's Voss now?" "He was last seen near the southern passage, the one that connects to the drainage culvert system." "The drainage system I ordered sealed 2 hours ago." "Yes, sir. It was sealed, but the southern section has a secondary access point that bypasses the main grate. It's not on the standard security plans. It was part of the original castle construction, before your grandfather's renovations." "And Voss knew about it." "Apparently so, sir." Kedrick stood. The broken pen fell to the desk. Ink spread across the deployment plans like blood across marble. His face was absolutely still, but his eyes had changed. The operational calculation was gone. In its place was something older and more dangerous. Something that Aldrich recognized from stories about the Duke's early years. Stories that ended with men wishing they had chosen different careers, different allegiances, different lives entirely. "He's a plant," Kedrick said. The words came out flat, toneless. The voice of a man processing a betrayal so fundamental that emotion had not yet caught up with comprehension. "Voss was placed inside my garrison specifically for this contingency. Garrett selected him because his service record was clean and his family had no Morcant connections. Which means either the service record was fabricated or his family connections were hidden well enough to survive 7 years of background screening. Sir, Garrett is beside himself. He's requesting permission to personally lead a pursuit team through the drainage system." "Deny it. If Voss reached the secondary access point, he's already outside the walls. He's carrying copies of whatever he could grab from the West Wing before the transfer was complete. Inventory logs, correspondence references, possibly partial financial records. Not enough to build a case, but enough to tell the Morcants exactly what kind of case I've been building against them." "What does that mean for the evidence in the Sea Vault?" "It means they know it exists. They don't know where it is, but they know it's real, and they know it's comprehensive, which changes their calculation entirely. Before tonight, they were coming for Evelyne. Now they're coming for the evidence. Evelyne is still the leverage, but the evidence is the target. If they can destroy what's in the Sea Vault before I release it, the 7 years of work becomes 7 years of nothing." Kedrick walked to the window. The torchlight from the walls threw orange patterns across the glass. Beyond the light, the Morcant encampment glowed in the distance like a wound in the darkness. "Bring Garrett to me. And find Evelyne. She needs to hear this." Aldrich hesitated. "Your Grace, it's nearly midnight. Miss Vale retired to her chambers 2 hours ago." "Then wake her. What's coming doesn't care about sleep schedules." Aldrich left. Kedrick stood at the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. Harlan Voss. The name repeated in his mind like a chisel striking stone. A man he had trusted by proxy. Through Garrett, through a chain of verification that he had believed was unbreakable. 7 years of building systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration. 7 years of screening, testing, observing. And a single operative placed with enough patience and enough precision to survive every filter had walked into the most sensitive room in Blackthorn Keep and walked out carrying the blueprints of Kedrick's entire strategy. This was what betrayal felt like. Not the dramatic revelation of fiction. Not the climactic moment of a villain unmasking themselves. It felt like arithmetic. Cold, precise, devastating arithmetic. The kind that recalculated everything you believed about your own competence and produced an answer that made your chest tight and your hands numb. His father had felt this in the final moments. Sitting at his own dinner table, drinking wine poured by a servant he trusted, feeling the first cramp in his stomach, and looking across the table at faces that smiled back at him while the poison worked its way through his blood. His father had felt this exact sensation. The understanding that the system you built to protect yourself contained the mechanism of your destruction. That the walls you constructed did not keep the enemy out. They kept the enemy close. And Kaedric, who had sworn on the frozen stones of his father's courtyard that he would never be caught the same way, stood in his study at midnight and felt the same poison moving through the architecture of his plans. Not chemical, strategic, the slow, methodical dissolution of every assumption that kept him upright. Garrett arrived first. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 2 hours. His face was raw. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the particular tremor that accompanied the absolute collapse of professional confidence. "I vetted him personally," Garrett said before Kaedric could speak. 14 months ago, his references were impeccable. His service record covered 9 years across 3 different garrisons. I interviewed his former commanders. I checked his financial history. I checked his family for 3 generations. And all of it was clean. All of it was clean. Which means all of it was manufactured. A 14-month investment. They placed him inside my household 14 months ago, which means the Morcants began planning this operation before Evelyne arrived, before the petition, before Thornwall. They've been inside my defenses since before I knew I had something worth defending. Garrett flinched, not at the words, but at the implication behind them. The realization that his role as Kaedric's most trusted advisor had been the exact vector through which the betrayal had occurred. Not despite his diligence, because of it. His thoroughness had been the credential that made Voss's placement possible. The Morcants had not bypassed Garrett's screening process. They had studied it, understood its criteria, and built an operative who met every single one. "How much did he get?" Garrett asked. "Enough. Not the full evidence cache. You moved that to the C vault in time. But the room itself contained reference materials, index documents, the organizational framework for the entire case. He didn't steal the evidence. He stole the map of the evidence, which tells the Morcants exactly how comprehensive my case is, exactly which conspirators are named, and exactly what kind of documentation I've been collecting. They'll burn everything they can reach on their end. They'll try, but the evidence is sourced from their own records. Intercepted correspondence, copied financial ledgers, transaction receipts from intermediaries who didn't know they were being documented. They can burn their copies, but they can't burn mine, and they can't unwrite the letters they sent or unspend the money they transferred. Then the evidence is still viable. The evidence is still viable if I can release it before they figure out where I've stored it and send someone to destroy it. The C Vault has 72 hours of security before the tidal access window reopens. After that, anyone with knowledge of the cove's geography could reach the vault during low tide. 72 hours. 72 hours to organize the release of 7 years of evidence to every power structure in Evelyne while simultaneously defending a castle under military siege with a garrison that just produced a traitor from its own ranks. Evelyne appeared in the doorway. She had dressed quickly, riding boots, the gray dress, her hair pulled back in the severe style she defaulted to when comfort became secondary to function. Her eyes moved from Kaedric to Garrett and read the room the way a physician reads symptoms. Quickly, accurately, without the luxury of hesitation. "Tell me," she said. Kaedric told her. All of it. Voss, the stolen documents, the 72-hour window, the recalculated reality of their situation. He spoke without softening the information because softening it would have been an insult to the woman who had chosen to stay, knowing exactly what staying meant. Evelyne listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The evidence needs to leave this castle," she said. "I know. Not through the roads. The Morcants control the southern approach, and they'll have scouts on the northern routes within a day. The sea route is the only viable option. A small vessel from the cove running at night carrying duplicates of the critical documents to contacts in the eastern ports, who can distribute them to the judicial authorities and foreign embassies simultaneously. Who carries them? Someone the Morcants won't expect. Someone whose absence from the castle won't trigger immediate pursuit. Evelyne looked at him. Her expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes. A decision being made. A calculation being completed. Me, she said. No. Think about it, Cedric. The Morcants are here for me. Every strategic decision they've made is oriented around my presence in this castle. If I leave through the sea vault, they won't know. They'll continue the siege assuming I'm still inside the walls. Every soldier, every scout, every intelligence asset they have will remain focused on Blackthorn Keep, while I'm already on the water with the evidence. And if they catch you on the open sea with the documents that prove their conspiracy to murder my father and corrupt the crown, then they'll have the evidence and the witness in the same place, which is exactly what they want and exactly what they'll do everything in their power to prevent from reaching its destination. The risk isn't capture, Cedric. The risk is that nobody carries those documents at all, and they rot in a sea vault while you fight a siege you can't win with a garrison you can no longer fully trust. Cedric's breathing changed, not dramatically, a slight acceleration, a fractional tightening of his chest, the kind of physiological response that a man who has trained himself to suppress every visible reaction can control on his face but not inside his body. She was right. The arithmetic was undeniable. Every piece of the logic connected. Every alternative was worse. And the woman standing in his study at midnight was offering to carry 7 years of his work through hostile waters to contacts she had never met, in a vessel she had never sailed, with no guarantee that she would survive the journey. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is about to lose. Not with drama, not with cinematic intensity, with the quiet, devastating clarity of someone who has spent his entire adult life controlling outcomes and is now confronting the one outcome he cannot control and cannot prevent and cannot survive if it goes wrong. If I let you do this, he said, and his voice carried a roughness that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the sound a human being makes when their throat constricts around words that cost more than language should allow. If I let you walk out of this castle carrying everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed, everything that connects my father's death to the men who caused it, if I let you do this and something happens to you on that water. He stopped. His hands were shaking, not his voice, not his face. His hands, the same hands that had killed men in this castle's corridors, the same hands that had shattered crystal at Thornwall, the same hands that had held a pen steady through 7 years of documenting atrocity. Those hands were shaking because the man they belonged to had just discovered the difference between risking his own life, which he could tolerate, and risking hers, which he could not. Then everything I am becomes meaningless, he finished. Every year, every sacrifice, every night in that locked room. Meaningless, because none of it was ever about justice, Evelyne. I told myself it was. I told Garrett. I told this castle. But it was never about justice. It was about making sure that the world that killed my father couldn't kill anyone else. He stopped again. Evelyne crossed the room. She stood in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breathing against his chest, close enough that the tremor in his hands was visible to her, and she did not look away from it. Say it, she said quietly. I can't. You can. You just haven't decided to yet. Deciding to say it makes it real, and real things can be taken. They can also be kept. Cedric looked at her. His silver eyes held the accumulated weight of 7 years of isolation and violence, and the systematic destruction of every human impulse that could be weaponized against him. And underneath that weight, visible only because his defenses had finally cracked far enough to let it through, was the terrified face of a 23-year-old boy standing in a frozen courtyard watching his name get erased from stone. I can't lose you, he said. I would survive the loss of this castle, the title, the evidence, the war. I would survive all of it because surviving is what I was built for. But I would not survive losing you, and the fact that I just said that out loud means I have given you the one weapon that can destroy me more completely than anything the Morcants could ever conceive. Evelyne reached up and placed her hand against his face. Her palm was warm, his skin was cold. The contact lasted 3 seconds and dismantled 7 years of architecture. I'm not a weapon, she said, and I'm not going to be destroyed. I'm going to carry those documents to the eastern port, and I'm going to put them in the hands of people who will make sure every name in that room gets read by every authority in Evelyne. And then I'm coming back. You can't promise that. No, but I can choose it, and that's more than either of us has had in a very long time. Cadric closed his eyes. His hand came up and covered hers against his face. The shaking stopped. Not because the fear was gone, because something stronger than fear had taken its place. Not courage, not resolve. Something more fundamental. The decision to let another person matter enough to change the way he moved through the world, knowing that the cost of that decision could be everything, and making it anyway because the alternative, the cold, controlled, untouchable existence he had maintained since his father's death, had already cost him more than he could afford to lose. When he opened his eyes, the man looking back at Evelyne was not the Duke of Ravenshade, not the Iron Ruler, not the strategic genius. It was someone new, someone assembled from the wreckage of who he had been and the possibility of who he could become. Someone who terrified him far more than any army or conspiracy or betrayal, because this person was vulnerable, and vulnerability was the one condition Cadric Ravenshade had sworn to never allow again. He allowed it. "Garrett," he said without looking away from Evelyne, "prepare the sea vault passage. Small vessel. 2 crew members you trust, not professionally, personally. Load the evidence." Garrett nodded. He left the study without speaking because there was nothing to say that the room had not already communicated in a language older than words. Cadric and Evelyne stood together in the candlelight, her hand against his face, his hand covering hers, while outside the walls of Blackthorn Keep 600 soldiers waited, and the stolen blueprints of 7 years of vengeance moved through the darkness toward men who would use them to destroy everything he had built. And somewhere in the castle, in a corridor that connected the east wing to the servant passages, a figure moved silently through the shadows. Not Harlan Voss. Voss was already beyond the walls. This was someone else, someone who had been inside Blackthorn Keep far longer than 14 months. Someone whose presence was so deeply embedded in the daily operations of the household that their movements generated no suspicion, no attention, no alarm. Aldrich the steward paused at a junction in the servant corridor. He listened. The castle was focused outward, every guard, every eye, every weapon pointed at the Morcant army beyond the gates. Nobody was watching inside. Aldrich reached into his coat and withdrew a small brass key. Not one of the 3 keys to the west wing, something different. Something that opened a door in the lower levels that Cadric did not know existed because it had been installed during the original construction, 200 years before the Ravenshade family took possession of the castle, and its existence appeared on no blueprint that had survived the renovations. A door that led directly to the sea vault. Aldrich turned the key in his fingers. His face was composed, professional. The face of a man who had served Blackthorn Keep for 15 years and had been waiting for this specific night for every single one of them. He stepped into the darkness, and the evidence that Evelyne was preparing to carry to safety was no longer safe at all. Aldrich reached the sea vault at 12 minutes past 1 in the morning. The passage descended through limestone carved 2 centuries before the Ravenshade name existed in Evelyne, a narrow throat of stone that smelled of brine and mineral deposits and the particular dampness that accumulates in spaces designed to be forgotten. His lantern threw a thin yellow cone ahead of him, illuminating walls slick with condensation and a floor worn smooth by water that had been seeping through the rock since before anyone alive could remember. The vault door was ironwood reinforced with salt-treated steel. Garrett's men had placed the evidence inside 4 hours ago, 3 locked chests containing the original documentation. Ledgers. Intercepted correspondence, financial records. Witness statements taken under conditions that Cadric had never described in detail because the methods of acquisition mattered less to him than the accuracy of the content. 7 years of methodical, relentless intelligence work, compressed into 3 chests sitting in a cave beneath the sea. Aldrich set his lantern on a natural shelf in the rock and studied the door. His key did not open this lock. This lock was new, installed by Garrett's men during the transfer. Heavy, resistant to picking. The kind of mechanism designed by someone who understood that the vault's location was its primary defense, but that redundancy was not paranoia when the stakes involved the survival of a noble house. He did not need to open the door. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small glass vial sealed with wax. The liquid inside was colorless, odorless, a chemical compound that, when applied to ironwood, created a reaction with the salt treatment in the steel reinforcement. The reaction was slow, silent. It would weaken the structural integrity of the door over approximately 6 hours, turning the ironwood brittle and the steel joints fragile enough that a single heavy impact would shatter both. Aldrich applied the compound along the door's hinges and locking mechanism with the steady hands of a man performing a task he had rehearsed many times in the theater of his own mind. When the vial was empty, he stepped back and examined his work. Invisible. The compound left no residue visible to the naked eye. By morning, the door would look identical to its current state. By the time anyone attempted to open it, the damage would be done, and the delay caused by a jammed or shattered lock would provide exactly the window the Morcan extraction team needed to reach the vault, through the tidal access point that Kaedric had estimated would reopen in 72 hours. Aldrich had a different estimate. The tidal charts he had been quietly studying for 3 years indicated the access point would be navigable in 36 hours. Not 72. Kaedric's calculation was based on standard tidal tables. Aldrich's was based on the spring tide cycle that occurred twice annually and happened to coincide with this particular week. 36 hours. Not 72. Half the time Kaedric believed he had. Aldrich retrieved his lantern and began the ascent back through the passage. His footsteps were measured, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who had learned 15 years ago that the most effective way to betray someone was to become so essential to their daily operations that suspicion never had a surface to attach to. He had poured Kaedric's wine, organized his correspondence, managed his household with an efficiency that the Duke had praised on multiple occasions. He had been present for conversations that should have been private, standing in doorways and corridors with the professional invisibility of a servant who understood that being overlooked was the most powerful position in any room. 15 years. The Morcants had invested 15 years in placing Aldrich inside Blackthorn Keep, not 14 months like Voss. 15 years, since before Kaedric's father died, since before the coup, since before the Ravenshade name became something that required destroying. Aldrich had served the father too, had watched the father eat the poisoned meal, had cleared the plates afterward with the same professional composure he carried now, ascending through the dark passage with a lantern in one hand and the knowledge that the most feared man in Evelyne was about to lose everything because he had never thought to suspect the man who organized his silverware. He emerged into the servant corridor at 137. The castle was focused outward, guards on the walls, officers in the command posts, every resource oriented toward the 600 soldiers beyond the gates. Nobody saw him. Nobody ever saw him. At 2 a.m, Kaedric descended to the sea vault with Garrett and 2 garrison soldiers carrying waterproof document cases. Evelyne walked behind them. She had changed into dark clothing suitable for a sea crossing, heavy wool, leather boots that laced to the knee, her hair braided tight against her skull in a style that prioritized function over anything else. Kaedric carried a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other, not because he expected to use it in the passage, because the weight of the weapon against his palm provided a tactile anchor for a mind that was operating simultaneously on 3 levels: the tactical reality of transferring evidence under siege conditions, the strategic calculation of what releasing that evidence would trigger across Evelyne, and the personal catastrophe of watching Evelyne walk toward a small boat in a dark cove, knowing that he might never see her again. The 3rd level was the loudest. He could not silence it. He had spent 7 years training himself to suppress every frequency of human need that interfered with operational function, and in this passage, at this hour, with this woman walking 4 steps behind him, every one of those frequencies was broadcasting at maximum volume, and his training was failing. This was what it meant to care about something more than survival. It meant your body stopped cooperating with the priorities your mind had established. It meant your hands wanted to reach backward instead of forward. It meant your breathing synchronized with the footsteps behind you instead of the terrain ahead. It meant that the man who had governed through absolute self-control was discovering, in a limestone passage beneath his own castle, That self-control was a myth you could maintain only as long as nothing existed that was worth losing control for. They reached the vault door. Garrett produced the key. He inserted it into the lock and turned. The mechanism resisted, not dramatically, a slight friction that should not have been there. Garrett frowned and applied more pressure. The key turned. The lock opened. But the door did not swing freely. It shifted with a sound that was wrong, a faint grinding, metal against metal with an underlying brittleness that suggested the components were no longer mating correctly. "Something's off," Garrett said. He pushed the door open and held his lantern inside. The three chests sat undisturbed. The vault appeared exactly as he had left it 4 hours ago. Nothing moved. Nothing was missing. But Garrett had survived decades of military service by trusting the specific quality of wrongness that certain sounds communicated. He ran his fingers along the door hinges. They felt different, slightly rough where they should have been smooth. A residue that was almost invisible but present in the way that damage is always present before it becomes visible. "Kedrick." The Duke moved to the doorway. Garrett showed him the hinges. "Someone's been here," Garrett said. "Chemical treatment, the kind that weakens ironwood over time. I've seen it used in sabotage operations against naval vessels. It eats the fiber structure of the wood and corrodes the salt treatment in the steel. This door will hold for now, but it won't survive another 12 hours. Kedrick touched the hinge. The residue came away on his fingertip. Colorless. Faintly alkaline. His nostrils flared at the chemical signature, and his pupils contracted, and for 3 seconds his face showed absolutely nothing at all, because the implications of what he was looking at exceeded the processing capacity of any single emotional response. Someone had been in this passage after Garrett's team completed the transfer. Someone with knowledge of the vault's location, the passage's route, and the specific chemical compound required to compromise an ironwood door. Someone inside Blackthorn Keep who was not Harlan Voss. A second operative. "Who had access to the passage entrance after the transfer?" Kedrick asked. His voice was level, controlled, the voice of a man who has absorbed a devastating blow and chosen to process the pain later because later was the only timeline that survival permitted. "My 2 men and myself. We sealed the entrance behind us when we left." "The entrance you sealed, is it the only entrance?" Garrett paused. The question was not casual. The question was a blade. "It's the only entrance on the current architectural plans." "Current plans. What about the original construction documents?" "The originals were lost during your grandfather's renovation. We've been operating from the updated blueprints since before I joined your household." "And who maintains the updated blueprints?" The silence that followed was the silence of a puzzle, completing itself in the worst possible configuration. Garrett's face went white. Not gradually, instantly, the blood draining from his features as if a valve had been opened. "Aldrich," Garrett whispered. Kedrick did not move. His hand still rested on the compromised door hinge. His eyes were fixed on the vault interior where 7 years of evidence sat in 3 wooden chests, undisturbed, but now operating on a timeline that had just been cut in half by a man who knew the original castle plans, because he had been studying them for 15 years while serving wine and organizing ledgers and standing in doorways with the professional invisibility that Kedrick had never once questioned. 15 years. The thought moved through him like something with a blade. Not the 14 months of Voss. 15 years. Before the evidence. Before the West Wing. Before the snow in the courtyard. Aldrich had been there when Kedrick's father was alive. Aldrich had been there the night his father died. Aldrich had served the meal. Aldrich had cleared the table. Aldrich had cleared the table. Kedrick's hand closed into a fist against the door. His knuckles ground against the weakened ironwood, and the pain was distant, irrelevant, a signal from a body that understood it was being damaged while the mind occupying it was busy collapsing an entire architecture of trust that had never been trustworthy. "He served the dinner," Kedrick said. The words came out in a register so low that Garrett had to lean forward to hear them. "The night my father died. Aldrich served the dinner. He was there. In the room. Carrying plates. Pouring wine." The implication detonated silently between them. Kedrick turned. Not slowly. Not with the controlled deliberation that defined his movements. He turned with the sudden, violent momentum of a man who has just realized that the servant who poured his father's last glass of wine was the same man currently walking free inside the castle where Evelyne slept. And the garrison trusted him, and every door opened at his instruction, because for 15 years nobody had thought to suspect the steward. "Find him," Kaedric said. The control was gone from his voice. What replaced it was something Garrett had heard only twice before. Both times, men had died. "Find him now!" Garrett ran. Kaedric turned to the two soldiers. "Load the evidence into the waterproof cases, all 3 chests. Move everything to the cove immediately. The vault is compromised." The soldiers worked. Kaedric turned to Evelyne. She stood in the passage behind him. Her face was still. Her eyes were not. Her eyes held the specific quality of shock that accompanies the realization that danger is not outside the walls. It is in the rooms you sleep in. It pours your tea. It knows where you keep your letters, and when you go to bed, and how many steps it takes to reach your door from the servant corridor. 15 years, she said. Yes. He could have killed you at any point. Killing me was never the objective. Controlling me was. And when control failed, dismantling me was. But doing it slowly, methodically, in a way that looked like external pressure rather than internal sabotage, so that when I finally fell, the Morcants could claim it was politics and not assassination. And tonight? Tonight the timeline accelerated because of you, because I brought you into the West Wing and showed you everything and Aldrich heard it. He was outside the door or in the corridor, or somewhere in the castle's circulatory system where sound travels through stone, and a man who has spent 15 years listening knows exactly where to stand. Kaedric's jaw was clenched so hard the tendons stood out like bridge cables. I exposed everything trying to protect you. And the man who watched my father die was 10 feet away taking notes. The soldiers finished loading the cases, 3 heavy waterproof containers holding the entirety of House Ravenshade's legal arsenal. They carried them toward the cove access, their boots splashing through the shallow tidal water that seeped through the passage floor. Kaedric followed. Evelyne walked beside him. The passage narrowed as it approached the sea, the walls contracting around them, until they were moving single file through a gap barely wide enough for the document cases. The cove opened before them like a wound in the cliff face. Black water, black sky. A sliver of moon that threw just enough light to distinguish the small vessel moored against the natural rock jetty. 2 crewmen sat at the oars. Garrett's selections. Men whose loyalty was personal rather than professional. Men who would die before surrendering their cargo because they had chosen to be here, and choice was the only foundation of trust that could not be fabricated. Kaedric helped load the cases into the vessel. His hands worked mechanically. His body functioned on the muscle memory of physical tasks, while his mind consumed itself with the understanding that Aldrich was still inside the castle, still moving through corridors that connected to every room, every passage, every strategic position. Still carrying keys that opened doors Kaedric did not know existed. Still breathing the same air as 300 people who trusted the steward because the Duke trusted the steward, and the Duke's trust was supposed to be the most carefully guarded commodity in Evelyne. Evelyne stood on the jetty. The vessel rocked gently in the cove's sheltered water. Beyond the cove's mouth, the open sea moved with a darkness that made the distinction between water and sky impossible. "Stay along the coast until you clear the northern headland," Kaedric told the crewmen. "Then turn east. The current will carry you toward Port Ashmore. Contact Marcus Teal at the Maritime Trading House on Saltwater Row. Give him the cases. Tell him the name Ravenshade sent you. He'll know what to do." The crewmen nodded. Kaedric turned to Evelyne. They stood 3 feet apart on a rock jetty in a cove beneath a castle under siege, and the distance between them felt like something that could be measured in years rather than inches. "Come back," he said. "I will." "That's not a request, Evelyne. That's the only thing I've asked anyone for in 7 years." She stepped forward, closed the distance, placed both hands flat against his chest, one above his heart. She could feel it hammering, irregular. The heartbeat of a man whose body was screaming information that his face refused to display. "I'll come back," she said, "and when I do, the evidence will be in every court and every embassy and every newspaper in Evelyne, and the men who killed your father and the man who served him his last meal will answer for it, not because you forced them to, because the truth forced them to." Kadrick covered her hands with his. His grip was tight, too tight, the grip of a man holding onto something while the current tries to pull it away. Then he let go. Evelyne boarded the vessel. The crewmen pushed off from the jetty. The oars dipped into black water. The boat moved toward the cove's mouth, becoming smaller with each stroke, becoming a shadow, becoming a suggestion of movement against darker darkness. Kadrick stood on the jetty until the vessel disappeared. Then he turned and walked back through the passage. His footsteps echoed off the limestone walls. His breathing was controlled. His hands were steady. Everything about his external presentation communicated the composure expected of a man who governed through precision and force. But inside, in the space behind his ribs where 7 years of armor had been constructed and where Evelyne Vale had somehow found passage through, something was exposed. Raw. Operational but damaged. The feeling of a man who has just sent the most important thing in his life into open water and turned around to face a castle full of enemies both identified and unknown. He emerged from the passage into the lower corridors of Blackthorn Keep and found Garrett waiting for him. Garrett's face told the story before his words could. "He's gone," Garrett said. "Aldrich. His quarters are empty. His personal effects are missing. He left through a passage in the lower kitchens that connects to the drainage system. A passage that doesn't appear on any blueprint we have." "Of course it doesn't." "Kedrick, there's more. The guards on the eastern wall reported a signal light from the Moorcant encampment approximately 20 minutes ago. 3 flashes. Pause. 3 flashes. A predetermined communication sequence. Someone inside the castle responded from the servant wing with a mirror flash. Aldrich signaling his extraction before he left. The timing suggests he communicated the status of the sea vault, the compromise of the door, and likely your plan to move the evidence by water." Garrett paused. "Which means the Moorcants know about the boat." The passage behind Kadrick breathed cold air against his back. The cove. The water. The small vessel carrying Evelyne and 3 chests of evidence toward a coastline patrolled by an enemy that now knew she was coming. Kedrick's body went very still. The stillness of a man who has processed the information and calculated the outcomes and arrived at a number that his mind accepts and his body rejects. The Moorcants had naval resources, patrol vessels stationed along the eastern coast for exactly the kind of interception that a small boat running at night was vulnerable to. If Aldrich's signal included the departure timing and the coastal route, the Moorcants could have cutters in position within 2 hours. Evelyne had a 30-minute head start. "Get me Merrick," Kedrick said. His voice was different. Not the controlled register of governance, not the cold precision of strategy. Something stripped down to its essential components. A voice operating on the minimum requirements of function, because everything above the minimum had been redirected to the single objective that now consumed every cell of his being. Merrick arrived at a run, young, competent, terrified in the way that competent men become terrified when they recognize that the situation has exceeded the parameters of anything they were trained for. "How many vessels do we have in the cove?" Kadrick asked. "2, Your Grace. A patrol cutter and a longboat." "Man the cutter, full crew, armed. I want it in the water within 15 minutes. The cove exit faces east, directly toward the Moorcant patrol line. If we launch a vessel, they'll see it." "I know they'll see it. That's the point. We run the cutter east at maximum speed, making as much noise and light as possible. Every Moorcant patrol vessel in the area converges on us. While they're focused on the cutter, Evelyne's boat slips north along the coast in the dark." "Your Grace, that's a decoy run." "Against an unknown number of enemy vessels. In the dark. The crew would be sailing directly into an interception force." "I'm aware of the tactical assessment, Merrick. Who commands the cutter?" Kedrick looked at him. The answer was in his eyes before it reached his mouth. "I do." Merrick opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The objection was visible in every line of his face, but the words could not assemble themselves into a sentence capable of contradicting the man standing in front of him. "Your Grace, if you're captured or killed on that water, Blackthorn Keep falls. The garrison has no authority without you. The legal case collapses. Everything you've built for 7 years dies on a patrol cutter in the dark. Everything I've built for 7 years is already on a boat heading east with 1 woman and 2 oarsmen. If that boat gets intercepted, the evidence is destroyed, Evelyne is captured, and the 7 years were for nothing, regardless of whether I'm standing on these walls or sinking in the ocean. Kedrick pulled his coat tighter. The cold from the passage had settled into his bones, and he could not tell whether the shaking in his hands was temperature or terror, and he did not care because both were irrelevant to what he was about to do. Man the cutter, 15 minutes, I'll be at the jetty. He turned toward the passage. Garrett stepped into his path. The two men faced each other in the corridor. Garrett, scarred and exhausted and carrying the weight of a betrayal that had passed through his own hands. Kedrick, stripped of every layer of strategic calculation and political maneuvering and operating on nothing but the raw, ungovernable imperative to keep one woman alive on a dark sea. You can't do this, Garrett said. Move. Kedrick, listen to me. You are the Duke of Ravenshade. 300 people in this castle depend on your survival. The entire legal case against the Morcants depends on your testimony. You are not expendable. You cannot sail a decoy cutter into enemy waters because you are emotionally compromised and making decisions based on fear instead of strategy. I'm making decisions based on the only thing that has ever mattered, and I spent 7 years pretending it didn't because pretending was safer than admitting that every title and every territory and every piece of evidence in those chests is worthless if there's nobody left worth fighting for. Kedrick's voice cracked on the last word. Not dramatically, a hairline fracture in the facade, enough to let the pressure escape, enough to show Garrett the man inside the armor. Move, Garrett, please. The please landed harder than any command. Garrett had heard Kedrick issue orders that ended careers and ruined families. He had never heard him say please. He stepped aside. Kedrick moved past him toward the passage. His footsteps echoed off the stone. His shadow stretched behind him in the lantern light, elongated and distorted, the shadow of a man walking toward something that either saved everything or ended it. At the cove, the patrol cutter sat in the water. 8 crewmen at their stations, oars ready. A lantern mounted at the prow that could be lit to maximum brightness, turning the vessel into a beacon visible for miles across open water. Kedrick boarded. The vessel rocked under his weight. He moved to the stern and gripped the tiller. Light the lantern, he said. The flame caught. Yellow light exploded across the dark water. The cove walls reflected it back in rippling patterns that turned the enclosed space into something theatrical, a stage set for an act that had no rehearsal and no guarantee of a second performance. Take us out, Kedrick said. The oars bit the water. The cutter surged forward. The cove mouth approached, a gap in the cliffs where sheltered water met open sea, where the controlled environment of stone and strategy gave way to the uncontrollable reality of wind and current and 600 men who wanted him dead. The cutter cleared the cove. Open water. Open sky. The moon casting just enough light to turn the sea surface into a field of shifting silver. And to the southeast, visible against the dark horizon, the running lights of 3 Morcant patrol vessels already moving into interception formation. They had been waiting. Aldrich's signal had given them everything. Departure time, vessel type, route. They had positioned their cutters to intercept a small boat running east along the coast, and now a larger vessel carrying a lit lantern and the Duke of Ravenshade himself was heading directly toward them, like a challenge written in fire on the surface of the sea. The Morcant vessels altered course, all 3 of them, converging on the light, somewhere to the north, in the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. A small boat carrying Evelyne Vale and 3 chests of evidence slipped along the coastline unseen. Kedrick watched the patrol vessels closing. His hand on the tiller was steady. His heart was not. It hammered against his ribs with the chaotic rhythm of a man who has abandoned every rule he ever made for himself and discovered that the space beyond those rules was not freedom, but freefall. The lead Morcant vessel was close enough now to see individual figures on its deck, armed men. Crossbows. Grappling lines coiled and ready. Kedrick's crewmen looked at him. 8 faces in the lantern light, waiting for an order, ready to execute whatever command came from the man at the tiller because they had chosen to be here. And men who choose their destruction are more dangerous than men who stumble into it. The distance between the vessels closed. 300 yards, 200, 150. Kedrick held course. 100 yards. The lead vessel fired a warning shot. A crossbow bolt punched through the water 2 feet from the cutter's hull. The crack of the bowstring carried across the gap between them like a question that demanded an immediate answer. Kedrick looked east, into the darkness where Evelyne's boat had vanished, where the evidence was moving toward Port Ashmore and the Maritime Trading House, and the contacts who would crack Evelyne's political structure open like a geode and show the rot inside. He could not see her. The darkness had taken her completely. But she was out there, moving, alive, carrying everything he was and everything he had been and everything he might still become, if the sea and the night and the slim mathematics of a 30-minute head start were enough. 75 yards. The Morcant vessels fanned into a pincer. Port and starboard closure. No escape angle. 50 yards. Kedrick gripped the tiller, sweat and sea spray mixed on his face. His pulse pounded in his temples with a force that blurred his vision at the edges. And then, from the darkness to the north, a sound that changed everything. Cannon fire. Not from the Morcant vessels, not from the cove. From the open sea to the north, where the darkness had been absolute and the horizon empty. 3 muzzle flashes lit the water in sequence, and the lead Morcant patrol vessel shuddered as 2 rounds struck its hull at the waterline. A warship emerged from the darkness. Flying no banner. Running no lights. A vessel 3 times the size of the Morcant cutters. Gun ports open along its broadside, moving with the deliberate momentum of something designed to end engagements rather than participate in them. Kedrick stared, his hand on the tiller locked. He did not recognize the ship. He had not summoned it. He had no naval allies capable of deploying a warship to the Evelyne coast on 12 hours' notice. A signal lamp flashed from the warship's bridge. Short, long, short, short. A code Kedrick had not seen in 7 years. A code that belonged to a communication system used by his father's intelligence network, the network that was supposed to have died with the old Duke, the network that Kedrick had spent years trying to reconstruct from the fragments Aldrich's betrayal had not reached. Someone had activated it. Someone who knew the old codes. Someone who had been watching, waiting, operating in the darkness the way Kedrick himself had operated for 7 years, building something invisible and patient and devastating. The signal lamp flashed again. This time, a single word in the old cipher, Evelyne. She had not just carried the evidence. She had carried a message to contacts Kedrick did not know existed. Using codes his father had created and someone, somewhere, had kept alive through 15 years of silence. The warship fired again. The second Morcant vessel took a hit to its mast. Canvas and rigging collapsed into the water. The third vessel broke formation and ran south. Kedrick stood at the tiller of his cutter, surrounded by 8 crewmen, drenched in spray and sweat, his heart slamming against the inside of his chest so hard he could feel it in his teeth, and watched a ghost ship dismantle the Morcant naval line with the systematic precision of something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this night. The lead Morcant vessel was sinking, its crew abandoned into lifeboats. The second was crippled and drifting. The third was a retreating light on the southern horizon, and from the warship's bridge the signal lamp flashed one final sequence. Hold position. Dawn changes everything. Kedrick's hand trembled on the tiller. He looked north, where Evelyne's boat was now beyond any interception. He looked east, where the first gray suggestion of dawn was beginning to separate the sea from the sky. He looked at the warship, sitting dark and massive on the water like something that had risen from the seafloor specifically to rewrite the rules of a war that Kedrick had believed he was fighting alone. Dawn was coming, and with it, the battle for Blackthorn Keep would enter its final hours. The Morcant army on land. Aldrich's betrayal inside the walls. The evidence racing toward Port Ashmore in a small boat crewed by 2 men and 1 woman who had somehow activated a dead man's intelligence network from the deck of a vessel in the dark. Kedrick turned the cutter back toward the cove. Behind him, the warship held its position on the dark water, guns trained south, waiting for the dawn that would change everything. And Kedrick Ravenshade, soaked and shaking and alive in a way that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the terrifying discovery that he was no longer the most dangerous piece on the board, sailed toward a castle he might not be able to hold and a war he could no longer fight alone. and a future that depended entirely on whether a woman in a small boat had made it past the darkness. His hands gripped the tiller. His eyes burned from salt. His chest ached with the specific pain of a man who has spent 7 years clenching his fist around his own heart and has just, involuntarily, opened it. Dawn was 40 minutes away. Dawn broke over Blackthorn Keep the color of bruised steel. Gray light spreading across the sea, turning the water from black to iron, revealing the damaged Morcant patrol vessel listing heavily to port a half-mile from the coast. Its crew had abandoned to lifeboats that bobbed in the swell like discarded teeth. The warship sat motionless on the water to the north, a dark silhouette against the brightening horizon. Its gun ports still open, its signal lamp dark. Waiting. Kadrick reached the cove at 5:12 in the morning. His clothes were soaked. Salt had dried white across his coat and in his hair and along the lines of his face, making him look older than 30, making him look like something the sea had tried to dissolve and failed. He climbed the passage from the jetty to the lower corridors with the mechanical precision of a body operating on adrenaline residue and nothing else. His muscles burned. His hands were raw from the tiller. His heartbeat had not returned to normal since the cannon fire, maintaining a tempo that felt less like circulation and more like a sustained argument between his body's demand for rest and his mind's refusal to permit it. Garrett met him at the passage entrance. The older man's face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent the last 4 hours managing a crisis while simultaneously processing a personal failure so complete that the word failure felt inadequate. Aldrich's betrayal had passed through Garrett's hands. Every background check, every reference verification, every professional assessment that had deemed the steward trustworthy had been conducted under Garrett's authority. The fact that the deception was 15 years deep and professionally impenetrable did not diminish the weight of it. If anything, the sophistication of the betrayal made Garrett's failure feel more architectural. Not a crack in the wall. A load-bearing column that had been hollow from the day it was installed. "Status," Kadrick said. "The Morcant ground force has not moved. 600 riders still holding position on the southern road. No assault attempt since the probing action yesterday evening. They're waiting." For what? For confirmation from their naval element, which they're not going to get because their naval element is currently sinking. Garrett paused. The warship to the north has made no attempt at communication since the signal lamp exchange. No banner, no identification. I have no explanation for its presence. Neither do I. But someone on that ship knew my father's cipher codes. Someone who has been monitoring Blackthorn Keep's situation closely enough to deploy a warship to exact coordinates at the exact moment of maximum tactical value. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because someone has been running a parallel operation that I didn't know about. Evelyne. Evelyne carried the evidence, but the signal lamp spelled her name, not a military command. Whoever is on that ship was looking for her, expecting her, which means she activated something during the crossing that goes beyond delivering documents to Marcus Teal. Garrett absorbed this. His jaw worked. The bruised circles under his eyes darkened as the dawn light from the corridor's arrow slits illuminated details that torchlight had been kind enough to obscure. Kadrick, if there's a network you don't control operating in your father's name, that's either an asset or a threat. There's no third category. I know, but right now it's the asset that prevented 3 Morcant cutters from intercepting the only thing that matters. So I'll take the uncertainty and deal with the categorization when the castle isn't under siege. He moved past Garrett into the main corridor. The castle was awake. Every corridor carried the muted energy of a household operating under battle conditions. Servants moved with purpose rather than routine. Guards stood at intersections that were normally unattended. The air itself felt different, compressed, as if the stones of Blackthorn Keep had absorbed the tension of the night and were radiating it back through every surface. Kadrick climbed to the battlements. The Morcant encampment was visible on the southern road, 600 riders in ordered ranks, their banners hanging limp in the windless dawn. From this distance, they looked almost decorative, almost ceremonial. The reality of what they represented, the military enforcement of a conspiracy that had killed his father and corrupted the crown and spent 15 years planting operatives inside his own household, did not translate visually. Violence at scale always looks smaller from above. It was only at ground level, where individual faces became visible and individual choices became consequential, that the full weight of it registered. Merrick joined him on the battlements. The garrison captain carried a field telescope, and the controlled demeanor of a young officer who had spent the night processing the revelation that the castle's steward was a Morcant operative and had determined that the most productive response was to focus on the things he could influence rather than the things he could not. "Movement in the Morcant ranks," Merrick said. He handed Caedric the telescope. "Rear element. A carriage arriving from the south under escort." Caedric raised the telescope. Through the lens, magnified and sharpened, he saw a black carriage with gilt trim approaching the encampment. The escort was ceremonial rather than military. Dress uniforms, polished armor. The kind of presentation designed to communicate authority rather than force. The carriage door opened. Lady Selene Morcant descended. She wore white. Against the gray dawn and the dark ranks of soldiers, the white dress was a deliberate provocation. Purity. Legitimacy. The visual assertion that whatever was about to happen carried the weight of moral authority rather than naked aggression. "She came herself," Caedric said. Merrick looked through his own glass. "That changes the calculation. If Selene is here personally, the Morcants are committed beyond recall. This isn't a probe anymore. This is the endgame." "The endgame started 15 years ago, Merrick. We just didn't know we were playing." A white flag appeared at the front of the Morcant formation, a single rider carrying it forward at a walk. The universal signal for parley. The ancient convention that enemies could speak before they killed each other, as if the words exchanged in the space between peace and war had ever prevented the war from coming. Caedric watched the rider approach. His body wanted to refuse. Every lesson 7 years had taught him. Argued against meeting Selene Morcant on any terms she had chosen. The woman whose family had murdered his father. The woman who had humiliated Evelyne at Thornwall. The woman who had orchestrated the petition, the military deployment, and almost certainly the placement of both Voss and Aldrich inside his defenses. But the warship sitting on the northern water changed the mathematics. The Morcants did not know what it represented. They did not know whose flag it served or what orders it carried. That uncertainty was leverage. And leverage, Caedric had learned during 7 years of navigating a world designed to destroy him, was the only language that power actually understood. "Open the gate," Caedric said. "I'll meet her in the courtyard." "Inside the walls?" "Inside the walls. If she wants to talk, she does it on my ground, under my roof, surrounded by my men. She can bring 2 escorts, no weapons. If she refuses those terms, she can sit on the road until the provisions in those 8 wagons run out, and her 600 riders start wondering whether Lady Morcant's political ambitions are worth starving for." The terms were delivered. Selene accepted. She entered Blackthorn Keep at 7:15 in the morning, flanked by 2 officers whose ceremonial swords had been confiscated at the gate and replaced with the specific discomfort of men who understood they were inside a hostile castle with no means of fighting their way out. The courtyard was lined with Ravenshade soldiers, not an excessive display, not a theatrical demonstration of force, simply every available man standing at attention in formations that communicated readiness without aggression. Caedric waited at the top of the main stairs. He had changed into clean clothing, dark coat, dark boots. No ceremonial decoration, no sword. The absence of a weapon was its own statement. A man who meets his enemies unarmed either trusts his position completely or has stopped caring about his own survival. Both options were unsettling. Selene climbed the stairs, each step measured. Her white dress moved against the dark stone like something that did not belong here and knew it. Her face was composed, beautiful in the architectural way that Caedric had always associated with her. A face designed rather than grown, every feature positioned for maximum impact, every expression calculated for optimal effect. She stopped 2 steps below him, a positioning choice that forced her to look up. She did not appear to mind. Some people understood that looking up at a man you intended to destroy was more powerful than meeting him at eye level, because it allowed him to believe he held the advantage right up until the moment he discovered he did not. "Your Grace," she said, "Lady Selene, I've come to offer terms." "I heard. Your terms arrived yesterday in the form of 600 soldiers, and a judicial writ that was signed after your army was already in motion. Forgive me if I approach this conversation with a certain skepticism about your commitment to diplomatic process. The military deployment was a precaution. The writ is legitimate. Miss Vale's guardianship arrangement violates established law, and the Crown Judiciary has ruled accordingly. I'm here to execute that ruling peacefully. Peacefully, with 600 armed riders. Peacefully, with the understanding that resistance to a Crown ruling carries consequences that neither of us wants to explore. Kedrick studied her. The morning light was harsh. It illuminated details that candlelight and chandeliers typically obscured. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes that cosmetics did not quite cover. The slight tension in her jaw that indicated she was controlling her expression through effort rather than ease. The almost imperceptible pulse visible at her throat, beating faster than her composure suggested. She was afraid. Not of him. Of something else. Something behind the mission she had come to execute. The kind of fear that belonged to a person operating under instructions that allowed no deviation and no failure, and carried consequences she could not afford to contemplate. Your father sent you, Kedrick said. It was not a question. Something flickered across Celine's face, quick, suppressed, the recognition of being read by someone whose perceptive capacity she had underestimated. My father supports the Crown's position. Your father is the Crown's position, Celine. He has been since before my father died. Since before his agents poisoned my father's wine at a dinner table served by a man your family planted in this household 15 years ago. Celine's composure did not crack, but her hands, clasped in front of her white dress, tightened against each other with a pressure that turned her knuckles pale. That's a serious accusation. It's a documented accusation. 7 years of documentation. Financial records linking Morcant accounts to the intermediaries who facilitated the assassination. Intercepted correspondence between your father and 3 members of the Crown Judiciary who fast-tracked every legal action taken against House Ravenshade since my father's death. Testimony from agents who participated in the coup and subsequently developed a preference for honesty over loyalty when presented with the appropriate incentives. If such evidence existed, you would have released it years ago. If I had released it years ago, your father would have destroyed it and me along with it. Timing, Celine. The difference between a detonation that collapses a building and one that collapses a mountain is not the size of the charge. It's where you place it. And where have you placed it? Beyond your reach. That's all you need to know. Celine was quiet for a moment. The courtyard around them held its collective breath. Soldiers on both sides stood motionless, their faces reflecting the particular tension of men who understood that the conversation happening on these stairs would determine whether they fought or stood down, lived or died. I came here to offer terms, Celine said. Her voice had changed, lower, the diplomatic veneer thinning enough to reveal something underneath that sounded less like authority and more like negotiation conducted from a weakening position. Surrender, Miss Vale. Allow the Crown ruling to proceed. In exchange, the military presence withdraws and your title remains intact. And the evidence? Destroyed. All of it. In exchange for your continued governance of the Northern Territory. You're offering me my own territory in exchange for the evidence that proves your family stole it. I'm offering you survival, Kedrick. Take it, because the alternative is a siege that ends with this castle burning and your name erased from Evelyne's history. Kedrick descended one step, then another, until he stood level with Celine, close enough to see the fear pulsing at her throat, close enough to smell the perfume she wore that did not quite mask the nervous perspiration beneath it. You want to know what's on the water to the north? He said quietly. The ship your scouts have been watching since dawn? The one that sank 2 of your patrol vessels last night and crippled the 3rd? Celine's eyes widened, a fractional dilation of the pupils that her composure could not prevent. That ship carries allies I didn't know I had until 12 hours ago. Allies who have been operating in silence since my father's death, waiting for exactly this moment. Allies who possess copies of every piece of evidence I collected, distributed through channels your father's network cannot reach, prepared for simultaneous release to every judicial authority, foreign embassy, and independent press outlet in Evelyne. He paused. Let the information settle. watched it work through Celine's expression the way acid works through metal, dissolving the surface layer to reveal the raw material underneath. The evidence is already gone, Celine. It left this castle last night on a boat your patrol vessels failed to intercept. By the time your 600 riders execute their next order, every conspirator named in those documents will be facing public exposure so comprehensive that no amount of crown influence can suppress it. Celine's composure broke. Not dramatically. A fissure. The slight parting of her lips. The involuntary blink. The almost invisible tremor that traveled from her clasped hands up through her forearms and into her shoulders. You're bluffing. I've never bluffed in my life. Ask anyone who's tested that assumption. Most of them can't answer because they're managing grain warehouses in the southern provinces. But the ones who still hold positions of relevance will confirm that Cedric Ravenshade does not say things he cannot substantiate. Celine stared at him. The white dress, the dark stairs, the gray morning light turning the courtyard into a stage where two people who represented opposing sides of a 15-year war stood close enough to touch and far enough apart to qualify as different species. "My father will destroy you," she said. The words came out stripped of diplomacy, raw. The voice of a woman who had spent her entire life inside a machine built on conspiracy and control and was now watching that machine encounter an obstacle it had not anticipated. "Your father tried to destroy me 15 years ago when he murdered mine. He failed. He tried again through legal manipulation. He failed. He tried again through military force. He's failing right now. And the reason he keeps failing is because your father operates on the assumption that every man has a price and every system can be corrupted and every threat can be eliminated through sufficient application of money and violence." Cedric leaned closer. Not threatening. Something worse. Certain. "Your father never accounted for someone who couldn't be bought, who couldn't be threatened, who spent 7 years in a locked room documenting every crime your family committed because the only alternative was becoming the kind of man who lets murderers sleep comfortably. I am that miscalculation, Celine, and miscalculations don't negotiate, they detonate." Celine held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned. She descended the stairs. She crossed the courtyard without looking back, her white dress moving against the stone like a surrender flag that had not yet been raised but had already accepted the inevitability of its purpose. Her escorts followed. The gate opened. The gate closed. 20 minutes later, the Morcant column began withdrawing south. Merrick confirmed the withdrawal from the battlements. 600 riders breaking formation and moving in retreat order down the southern road, their banners furled, their pace communicating not urgency but the mechanical resignation of a force whose mission had been rendered irrelevant by events beyond its control. Celine's carriage led the column. The white dress was no longer visible through the windows. Cedric watched from the battlements until the last rider disappeared beyond the southern ridge. Then he stood alone on the wall, looking at the empty road and the gray sea and the warship still holding position to the north, and he breathed. For what felt like the first time in 12 hours. A breath that went all the way down into the bottom of his lungs and stayed there for a moment before releasing, carrying with it a tension so deeply embedded in his body that its departure left him feeling structurally compromised, as if the tension had been load-bearing and without it, certain parts of him no longer had sufficient support. He gripped the battlement wall. The stone was cold and rough under his palms. Real. Solid. Anchoring him to a present moment that his mind had not fully arrived in because parts of it were still on a patrol cutter in the dark, still watching Morcant vessels converge, still gripping a tiller with raw hands while cannon fire rewrote the rules of a war he had believed he was fighting alone. He was not alone. That was the truth his body was trying to process, and his mind kept deflecting because processing it required acknowledging that 7 years of enforced isolation had not been strength. It had been damage. The kind of damage that looks like architecture from the outside, all clean lines and structural integrity, but from the inside is just a man standing in an empty room wondering when the walls he built to protect himself became the walls that trapped him. Evelyne had walked through those walls, not with force, not with strategy, with the simple, devastating act of looking at him and seeing not the Duke or the strategist or the most feared man in Evelyne, But the exhausted human being underneath, who had been carrying a dead father's legacy in one hand and a living man's loneliness in the other, and had convinced himself that both weights were the same. They were not the same. One was duty. The other was the cost of performing that duty without anyone to share it with. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a man who survives and a man who lives. And Kaedric had been surviving for so long that he had forgotten the distinction existed. He remembered now. 3 days passed before the warship made contact. A longboat launched from its side on the morning of the third day, carrying 4 men in unmarked uniforms and a sealed leather case. They approached Blackthorn Keep's Cove with the calm efficiency of professionals who had done this before, navigating the tidal access with a familiarity that suggested they knew the cove's geography from something other than charts. Garrett met them at the jetty. He brought the sealed case to Kaedric's study. Inside was a letter, handwritten. The handwriting was not Evelyne's. It was his father's. Kaedric recognized it immediately. The specific slant, the particular pressure, the way certain letters connected and others stood alone. A penmanship as distinctive as a fingerprint belonging to a man who had been dead for 7 years. He read it standing. Then he read it again sitting. Then he set it on his desk and pressed both hands flat against the surface and closed his eyes and breathed through the specific quality of pain that accompanies the discovery that a dead parent left something behind that you did not know about, and that the something changes the shape of everything you believed about their death and your survival of it. The letter was dated 4 months before the assassination. His father had known. Not the specifics, not the timing, but the trajectory. He had seen the Morcant conspiracy forming and had understood that his position was untenable and had made preparations for the aftermath. The warship, the cipher network, the contacts in the eastern ports. All of it established during the final months of his father's life by a man who understood he was going to die and chose to spend his remaining time building a safety net for the son who would inherit the destruction. His father had not been naive. He had not been the trusting, open-hearted ruler that Kaedric's grief had constructed from memory and regret. He had been a man who saw the blade coming and could not dodge it, and chose instead to ensure that the person he loved most would have the tools to fight back after the blade fell. The letter did not say, "I love you." It said, "When you are ready, use what I have left you, and when it is over, build something that does not require you to become what they are." Kaedric sat with the letter for a long time. The study was quiet. Dust moved through the light from the window. The sea was calm for the first time in days, its surface reflecting the sky with an accuracy that made it difficult to determine where the water ended and the air began. Garrett found him there at noon. The older man stood in the doorway and waited because he had learned decades ago that certain silences were not meant to be interrupted but witnessed. "He knew," Kaedric said without looking up. "Your father?" "He knew they were coming. He built the network, the ship, the contacts, all of it, in 4 months. While he was governing the territory and attending council meetings and sitting across from the men who were planning to kill him, he built a contingency for me while dying was the most probable outcome of his next dinner." Garrett entered the room. He sat in the chair across from Kaedric's desk, the same chair Edmund Vale had occupied the night he delivered his daughter to Blackthorn Keep. The leather creaked. The sound was mundane, ordinary. The kind of sound that belongs to a world where men sit in chairs and have conversations, and the weight of history does not press down on every surface like gravity multiplied. "Your father was the most strategic man I ever served," Garrett said. "I told you that when you were 23 and you didn't believe me because you were too busy being angry at him for dying. You thought his openness was weakness. His trust was naivety. His willingness to see the good in people was the flaw that got him killed." It was. No, it wasn't. The flaw that got him killed was that the men around him were capable of murder. That's their flaw, not his. Your father's trust was not a mistake, Kaedric. It was a choice. He knew the risk, and he chose it anyway because he understood something that took you 7 years and 1 woman and a siege and a warship from the dead to figure out. And what's that? That building walls keeps you alive, but it doesn't keep you human. And a man who sacrifices his humanity for survival has already lost the thing he was trying to survive for. Kaedric looked at Garrett. The old soldier's face was lined and tired and carrying the weight of 15 years of service to 2 men from the same bloodline who had each in their own way tried to navigate a world that punished openness and rewarded cruelty. I became what they were, Cadric said quietly. That's what the 7 years did. The surveillance, the intimidation, the executions, the cold, all of it. I told myself I was being strategic, that the brutality was calculated, that every act of cruelty served the larger objective of bringing down the conspiracy. But that's just the story I told myself so I could sleep at night. The truth is, I became cruel because cruelty was easier than grief, easier than vulnerability, easier than admitting that the 23-year-old boy standing in that courtyard watching the Masons was not angry at the kingdom. He was terrified. And he spent 7 years converting terror into power because power was the only thing that made the terror stop. And now? Now the terror is back. Different. Not the terror of being destroyed. The terror of having something worth protecting and knowing that protecting it requires me to be a different man than the one I've been. A man who can be hurt, who can be wrong, who can stand in a room full of enemies without armor and survive not because they fear him, but because the people beside him chose to be there. He touched the letter on his desk. His father's handwriting, the last communication from a dead man who had known the cost of openness and paid it and still chosen to leave his son a message that said, "Build something that does not require you to become what they are." I don't know how to be that man, Garrett. I know how to be feared. I know how to be obeyed. I know how to sit in a locked room and document atrocity and convert pain into strategy and strategy into results. But I don't know how to be the person she sees when she looks at me, the person my father apparently believed I could become. I don't have the architecture for it. Then build new architecture. You've done it before. You tore down everything your father left and rebuilt it from grief and iron. You can tear it down again and rebuild it from something better. What if what I build is worse? What if it isn't? The question hung in the study like smoke. Kedrick did not answer it. Some questions were not meant to be answered in conversation. They were meant to be answered in the years that followed, through decisions made and relationships maintained in the slow, unglamorous process of becoming a person whose strength did not depend on the elimination of tenderness. Evelyne returned to Blackthorn Keep on the 7th day. The boat appeared around the northern headland at mid-morning, running with the current, its sails catching a wind that had shifted from the east overnight. Kedrick saw it from the battlements where he had been standing every morning since she left, scanning the horizon with a discipline that he refused to call hope, and everyone around him recognized as exactly that. He descended from the battlements, crossed the courtyard, took the passage to the cove. His pace was controlled, measured, the pace of a man who understood that running would communicate a desperation he was not prepared to display publicly. But when he reached the jetty and the boat was close enough to see individual figures on its deck, his pace broke. Not into a run, into something between a walk and a surrender. The momentum of a body overriding a mind that had spent 7 years insisting that urgency was weakness. Evelyne stood at the bow. She was thinner. Her face carried the particular rawness of someone who had spent a week on open water with minimal shelter and the constant awareness that pursuit was possible. Her dark hair was loose, tangled by wind and salt. Her hands gripped the rail with knuckles that were cracked and reddened. She looked like she had fought something and won and paid for the victory in ways that would take time to fully assess. The boat reached the jetty. Ropes were secured. Evelyne stepped onto the stone platform and stood 3 feet from Kedrick in the gray light of the cove, surrounded by the sound of water lapping against rock and the distant cry of seabirds and the silence of 2 people who had said everything important during their last meeting and now needed to determine whether the words still held. Marcus Teal received the evidence, Evelyne said. Distribution began 4 days ago. Crown Judiciary, foreign embassies, independent press in 3 territories. The documents are in public record now. They can't be recalled or destroyed or denied. I know. Reports started arriving 2 days ago. 3 members of the Crown Judiciary have resigned. Lord Selwyn Morcant has been formally charged with conspiracy to commit assassination and corruption of Crown authority. The Crown itself has issued a statement distancing the monarchy from the Morcant faction and calling for a full independent investigation. It's over then. The conspiracy is over. What comes after is a different conversation. Evelyne looked at him, searched his face for the things she had seen in his study the night he told her he could not survive losing her. It was still there, altered. Not the raw, cracked open desperation of that night. Something quieter. Something that had been through fire and come out the other side, not hardened, but tempered. The way steel becomes stronger, not by adding material, but by heating it past the point of tolerance and allowing it to cool into a new configuration. "You look different," she said. "I am different." "How?" "I read a letter from my father. He built the warship network, the contacts, all of it, before he died. He knew what was coming, and he spent his last months building something that would protect me after he was gone. Not through force, through trust. He trusted people I've never met to hold a network together for 7 years on the chance that his son would eventually need it. And you spent those 7 years believing trust was the weakness that got him killed." "Yes." "Was it?" "No. It was the strength that kept me alive. I just didn't know it because I was too busy building walls against the very thing that was saving me." Evelyne stepped forward, closed the 3 feet of distance, stood close enough that Cadric could feel the cold radiating from her salt-stiffened clothing and the warmth radiating from underneath it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Blackthorn Keep gets rebuilt. The burned sections, the compromised passages, the west wing gets opened permanently. No more locked doors, no more secrets preserved in darkness." "And the man inside the castle?" Kedrick looked at her. His silver eyes held steadiness rather than storm. Not the absence of intensity, but the presence of something that had learned to coexist with intensity without being consumed by it. The man inside the castle learns how to live in the rooms he built instead of hiding in the walls between them. The man inside the castle stops treating vulnerability as a deficiency and starts treating it as the cost of being worth a damn. The man inside the castle looks at the woman standing in front of him and says the thing he was too afraid to say in a dark study at midnight because saying it made it real, and real things can be taken. He paused. His breathing was even. His hands were still. 7 years of armor, and underneath it a man who had finally stopped fighting the truth that the armor was designed to suppress. "I love you, Evelyne. Not the way I love strategy or power or the satisfaction of watching an enemy's infrastructure collapse. I love you the way a man loves something that changed him against his will and made him better against his preference and showed him that the version of himself he was clinging to was not strength, but scar tissue shaped to look like strength." Evelyne's eyes filled, not with sadness, with the specific release that comes when someone you have been waiting to hear finally says the thing you knew they were carrying but could not reach. That's a lot of words for a man who doesn't believe in sentiment. "I'm learning. Give me time. The architecture is new, and the foundation is still curing." She laughed, short, rough, the laugh of a woman who had crossed hostile seas and carried the weight of a dead man's evidence and returned to a castle full of damage and found the damaged man inside it standing on a stone jetty, saying "I love you" with the awkward precision of someone who had never said it before and was building the syntax in real time. She put her hands on his chest. He covered them with his. The cove was quiet around them. Water, stone, the distant presence of a warship that carried a dead father's last act of love. The castle above, scarred and standing, waiting to be rebuilt by people who understood that strength was not the absence of damage, but the decision to remain standing inside it. 6 months later, Evelyne Vale became Duchess of Ravenshade in a ceremony held not in the Grand Hall, but in the rebuilt courtyard where Cadric had once stood at 23, watching masons erase his name from stone. She wore dark silk. He wore no gloves. The scar on his hand from the shattered wineglass at Thornwall was visible to everyone in attendance, and he did not cover it because scars were not things to hide. They were things to show. Evidence that damage had occurred and survival had followed, and the man standing beside her was not the same man who had entered this courtyard 7 years ago, carrying grief like a weapon. The kingdom whispered about Cadric Ravenshade for years afterward, about the way enemies who threatened his family disappeared into legal proceedings so thorough that resistance was algebraically futile, about the terrifying calm he maintained during negotiations that reduced seasoned politicians to nervous silence, about the way he governed the Northern Territory with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural, as if the man had been built specifically for the exercise of power and had simply learned over time to exercise it without cruelty. But inside Blackthorn Keep, in the corridors that no longer carried the weight of enforced silence, in the rooms that now held the sounds of conversation and argument, and the occasional laughter that echoed off stone walls, in a way that made the castle feel less like a fortress and more like a place where people actually lived, a different version of Caedric Ravenshade existed. He still worked late. He still reviewed intelligence reports and financial ledgers, and the correspondence of allies whose trustworthiness he verified not through suspicion, but through the patient maintenance of relationships built on mutual respect rather than fear. He still carried the particular intensity that had defined him since his father's death, the coiled energy of a man who understood that the world contained threats and that vigilance was not paranoia, but responsibility. But he no longer worked alone. Evelyne sat across from him most evenings, reading or writing or engaged in the quiet productivity of two people who had learned that shared silence was not absence but presence, the most intimate form of trust, the willingness to exist in the same space without performance or pretense. And every night, in the darkness of the chambers that overlooked the sea, where waves still hammered the black cliffs with the same violence they had carried for centuries, Caedric reached for her hand, not because he feared waking to find her gone. That fear had not disappeared entirely. It lived in the same space where his father's memory lived, and the sound of execution bells lived, and the image of a white dress descending castle stairs lived. Those things did not vanish. They did not heal cleanly. They became part of the architecture. Load-bearing memories that supported the structure of a man who had decided that carrying them was preferable to pretending they did not exist. He reached for her hand because reaching was the act that separated the man he had been from the man he had chosen to become. The man he had been would have lain in the dark and endured the silence and converted the loneliness into fuel for tomorrow's strategic operations. The man he had become understood that reaching across the darkness toward another human being was not weakness. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than the siege. Harder than the cutter in the dark water. Harder than standing on a jetty and saying 3 words that his mouth had never shaped before. Reaching was the act that required him to admit, every night, that he was not self-sufficient. That the walls he had built could not keep out the things that actually mattered. That the most dangerous man in Evelyne needed someone. And that needing someone, after everything he had been through, was not the vulnerability he had always believed it to be. It was the proof that he had survived. Evelyne always held his hand back, not because she pitied him, not because she felt obligated, because she understood, in the way that only someone who had walked into a monster's castle wearing damp velvet and defiance could understand, that the hand reaching for hers in the dark belonged to a man who had dismantled himself and rebuilt from the wreckage and chosen, against every instinct that 7 years of brutality had installed, to be someone capable of this single, terrifying, ordinary act of love. And in the darkness of Blackthorn Keep, where the sea roared beneath the cliffs and the candles burned in corridors that no longer felt dangerous, 2 people held on to each other, not because the world outside had become safe, but because they had learned that safety was not the absence of threat. It was the presence of someone worth facing the threat beside. And that was enough. It had always been enough. They just had to nearly lose everything to find it.